Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to this second in-person festival of finance innovation that is sponsored by NATURANCE, Nature for Insurance, Insurance for Nature. So we will be talking for 3 days about interesting topics, how to connect biodiversity, conservation, ecosystem restoration with financial services like insurance. And we will look into policy, solution, and networking. But before we start, I would like to introduce my co-chair, that's Priscila Franco Steier, who is from ICLEI. She's the senior researcher on ecosystems and nature-based solutions. And she has something like many years, although it doesn't look like, but she's very experienced in organizing projects and organizing the activities. Priscila, it's lovely to have you.
Yeah, welcome everyone. Very happy to see you here. Some faces that we already met in the morning during the side event we had here. I'm also very pleased to introduce you to Mysiak. Mysiak. He is from CMCC, also a principal scientist, and focusing mainly on climate risk management. And he is the coordinator of NATURANCE project, together with other colleagues from CMCC, who support a lot to deliver this event today.
Thank you very much.
Now I would introduce the director of ICLEI Brussels office, Peter De Franceschi, to do some opening welcome to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Very welcome from my side, also to this NATURANCE Finance Innovation Festival. It's the first time that I go to a festival on finance innovation, but looking at this top location between the Magritte Museum and the Royal Palace, and looking at you people, I must say, I love it. So indeed, I'm heading the Brussels office of ICLEI, who, as you know, is a European and globally operating network of very big and very small cities committed to urban sustainability and urban resilience. If you see a city or town with a lot of nature, it's most likely an ICLEI member. And I salute very much the diversity of stakeholders here. I hear there are researchers, there are practitioners, there are finance experts, insurance experts. We all know how important multi-actor approach is to achieve impact. And diversity is something that we get from nature, because nature par excellence is biological biodiversity. It's biodiverse nature. And we need biodiversity and a biodiverse nature for resilient cities. Being in Brussels, I see two trends, positive trends, also related to this topic here. On one hand, I see that globally a growing support for using and having nature to adapt to climate change, to using nature to cool down cities. And it's no longer whether it's left or right or green or liberal. It's something that makes common sense. More and more politicians in cities say, well, we cannot have our big, square here without any tree. We see big cities leading, like here close by Paris, but also in Brussels. A lot has changed in the center with nature. We need nature in many ways, because we need a biodiversity nature for resilient cities. And then we see also another trend, which is, let me check my notes, which is indeed the reality that we see in many cities of how it is if a city and the city administration does not work with nature. It's clear that it's more and more imperative, and all cities and towns get it from the reality that we see, that cities must work with nature and not against nature. And finally, let me share a little crazy vision. And indeed, our office is right on the way to the European Parliament, and once a year there's a lot of action. It's when the farmers come with their tractors. And it's a long line that never ends, and no other demonstration creates as much panic. So my little dream is that one day on the tractors are not just farmers, but also mayors, to not demonstrate against something, but demonstrate to a more symbiosis between the urban and the rural, because farmers are the best ones to understand the soil, the nature, the land. And I think it's important to overcome also this urban-rural gap in order to have more nature, use more nature for resilient cities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I share this vision. It would be really lovely to see the local administrations manifesting for better environment and for better policies to protect the environment. So I hope you are all comfortable. A part of the audience sitting in this room, I would like to also welcome our online audience. I was told we have more than 200 subscriptions, right? So we have many people also attending online. Welcome to you as well. Thank you very much for joining us. And a couple of words before I hand over to the first keynote speaker, a couple of words about this initiative. So we started 3 years ago, right? And we started to look into how to connect the nature restoration and ecosystem services with financial services like insurance-linked securities or risk transfer, risk management, finance in general. And we have been looking into 3 main components. The first one, we brought together the communities. So we have established a network of networks. We have been working together with the local and the regional authorities. We have been working with the financial groups and the knowledge networks dedicated to sustainable finance. We have been working with risk analysts and cat risk modelers. And then we have been working also with business innovation people in general. So we have created a ecosystem of people coming from different knowledge domains and epistemic communities in order to start talking about what we can do. The second thing that we have done, we have launched innovation laboratories. This is something that that provided the context in which we explored the prospective solutions, how those solutions that we have draw on the paper, whether they can work. And we looked from the different perspective in specific location and in specific political or policy environments. So we have had all together 9 innovation laboratories, and you will find all the information about what we have done also on our knowledge platform that is broadcasted in the back of this room. And the third thing that we did, we tried to stimulate the dialogue about what are the guiding principles, right? What should guide development of these innovative solutions, and also how to measure the success. What are the metrics that can be used in order to demonstrate that we are doing something, that we have achieved the impacts. And with these, and you will learn more about all what we have done, we have also launched the SEN workshop agreement. This is a sort of progress on standardization that is bottom-up. It's really community-based, coming from the community, but it's overseen by the standardization bodies. And that has been very lovely and interesting experience. And you will also learn about the outcomes of this. So this is all what is waiting for you, a rich agenda of talks about policy drivers, about solutions, about networking, the community initiatives coming from NATURANCE, but also from other opportunities, other contexts, right? So this is what we are looking forward to.
Yeah, I would like to introduce you shortly to an overview of our agenda. Okay, so thanks. Yeah, just building on what Jaro just mentioned, NATURANCE is framed by building knowledge across different expertises, through our knowledge network, but also connecting to different projects and initiatives that are talking about finance and insurance. So our festival is mirroring that structure, right? So we will have 3 days starting today. Today we'll focus more on the policy landscape from the EU perspective, but also from the private initiatives perspective. And tomorrow we will focus more on the solutions. So insurance solutions, also finance solutions, And then tomorrow there will be already a lot of space for active participation of all of you. So we're going to have breakout sessions. We're going to have also a World Cafe. And finally, the last day, we will focus on the legacy and the key messages that NATURANCE, along with the sister projects, have been developing mainly on policy recommendations in the morning, in the first part of the morning. And the second part, you're going to hear how we have posters, presentations from cities, sharing with us their experience on engaging citizens in nature-based solutions. So this is a very quick overview of our 3 days, and some also general, or we skip this part, general logistic messages. Yeah. So yeah, we also have an online event happening at the same time. So that you need to know that the plenary sessions are live streamed and recorded. So let us know if you have any issue regarding that. We also have a media corner available for interviews during breaks. So let us know if you want to be interviewed by us. And also we will approach you for that. We have the Wi-Fi. If you haven't seen and you need to connect, there is also there the credentials to log into the Wi-Fi. You also have it here. And to the end, for this end of the day today, we have two important messages to you. One is that we would like to have a group picture that will be taken in the Bro venue outside of the building. And to close the day, we will have a social dinner between 5:30 and 8. So you're invited to stay, that we can also, socialize a bit more, share our insights, or just have fun together. So I think that is it for the, this is a venue map where we are. I need to find myself. Anyone has a tip? We're not in BIP reception guichets, right? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we are here, guichets. You can find toilets right here down the hall. And we're going to work also tomorrow in some of these other rooms for the breakout rooms, but you're going to receive also better instructions tomorrow on that. And the Braille there, this other purple area is where we're going to have the group pictures, and the dinner will be served here from 5:30 on, right? So I guess now hand over to you again.
Oh. Thank you very much. And now, without any further ado, I would like to invite our keynote speaker, who is Doug Mason. Doug can be introduced in many different ways, but I would like to introduce him with the impact of his work. So he's an expert on build infrastructure, nature infrastructure, and through his work, he helped to develop over $40 billion in order to restore more than 44 million hectares of natural land. So these are great achievements, right? We typically introduce people with a role, and this is the impact that you have on the ground. Doug, and he's doing that now in his position as the Director of Environmental and Social Performance of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a US-based development agency. But he's really a person that is able to connect the private and public sector across different scales of impact. And he's also going to showcase his work, how he's able to connect the different epistemic communities I was talking about. So it's really a great pleasure. Doug, we are looking forward to listening to your live experience. And thank you for accepting our invitation. So the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Is this on? So I wanted to start by taking you to the watershed where I live. Now, the medical research says that even just looking at nature without any interaction at all has huge cognitive benefits. It helps improve working memory. It improves attention and executive functioning. So given all the work that we have to do together in the next 3 days, I thought just looking at this picture for a moment would be a good start. But of course, we know nature can do much more than just that. So this image looks natural, but this is actually an example of hybrid infrastructure, a combination of built and natural elements. Because what you're looking at is the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. This is an old idea. This was actually the brainstorm of our first president, George Washington. And the intent was to make the Potomac River, which this runs along, navigable. So this canal runs for about 300 kilometers, and in its day, it was responsible for transporting heavy goods like coal and farm products. Now, of course, today we have other mechanisms for transport, but the Potomac River watershed is still really important for another reason. And that, a picture of the canal in use back in the day. And that is flood risk. So Washington, D.C. faces flood risk for several ways. One is upstream riverine flooding, right? As storms become increasingly strong and there's huge downpours, flooding is important. You're looking at Great Falls National Park during one of those floods. Where D.C. sits also means that there can also be flooding coming upstream from the coast. It's a tidal estuary where a severe storm along the coast can push water upstream as well, in addition to pluvial flooding in the city. So in the watershed, there are interesting examples. For some reason, it's not forwarding. There, of managing this risk. I want to cite one as an example. So DC Water is the utility for Washington, D.C. Back in 2016, they were interested in reducing flood risk associated with water going into the Potomac River. And they were interested in using solutions as a tool that combination roofs and makers of DC Water, they were about the cost reductions. But as is probably common, they were a little bit worried about performance because they understood the infrastructure better than green infrastructure. And this is where DC Water had our nation's first environmental impact bond. It was a $25 million, and it was a pay for success model. So the way it worked was, if the green infrastructure performed as intended, there was no payout. But if it failed, then the bond would pay to ensure that the level of performance they sought was met. Now, the good news is the green infrastructure worked. It reduced by 20% in Washington, D.C., the water that was going into the Potomac River. So the bond didn't have to pay. In fact, it was paid off in 2021. So this is an example of where the engineering side worked and also the financial engineering side worked. What we're talking about. Here's the rub. Oh, sorry. This is good, and it was 10 hectares. I think our fundamental challenge is we need to scale in a dramatic way. We need many more projects. We need much larger projects, and we especially need to deliver projects much more quickly. And so I'm looking forward to talking with all of you about how we do that. So I'm Doug Mason. I'm going to share a few of the ideas, people, and products that have inspired me and helped inform my thinking. I'm mostly interested in talking with all of you because I think these challenges are huge and complex, but we face a lot of common cause. So I look forward to learning from all of you. I work more on the infrastructure side, so I will defer to the insurance experts in the room on that. That said, all of the ideas I'm sharing today are mine. They're not necessarily the opinions of any organization I work with or talk with. So I assume responsibility for that. I'm going to organize my thoughts in sort of three broad categories. One is increasing confidence in the performance of nature-based solutions. Another is how can we harness the incentives to scale up, whether they're economic or social or other, and how can we also then remove some of the barriers that are getting in the way of that. Now, you'll notice I've tried to include some QR codes so that if you're inspired by the same things that inspire me, you can go to the source. You don't have to just take it from me. I understand from the organizers that this PowerPoint is going to be shared with you, so you don't have to worry about capturing them all, but I hope that they're useful. So I just want to take 2 minutes to talk about what is infrastructure, at least how I think about it, so you'll understand where I'm coming from. So infrastructure just means infra, that part means below, and structure means the underlying structure. So this is the the underlying structure that we need for our country and our economy to function. The reason I think this is important is we tend to think about infrastructure sometimes as assets, things, right? We think about the bridges and the roads and the rail lines. That's all true, but I would encourage us to think about more in terms of the services that those assets provide. I'm an ecologist by training, so this would be more flows rather than stock. And the reason I think that's important is because that's where nature comes in, right? Like, while traditionally we think about it as built assets, often nature can provide those very same services. One thing that's really important, though, is to think about this as a system, right? Because there are interdependencies between infrastructure elements that are really important, especially when the catastrophic risk in one part of infrastructure can cascade into another. So, for example, we all know that if there's a severe storm, that can affect both natural and built elements. So let's imagine there's a heavy downpour and it takes out a bridge. Okay, well, you have a transport problem, right? The bridge is gone. But if that bridge is how sick people get to the hospital, well, now you have a public health delivery system challenge as well. And if we look at infrastructure in a way that's too isolated, we lose these interconnections, and that could lead to big problems for us. And traditionally, our institutions often do that. They tend to often think sort of, I'm the power sector, this is what I work on. And so those connections we have to bear in mind. All of you are very familiar with another challenge, right? It's hard enough to define the infrastructure in a way that serves us today, but that's not our only challenge, right? In the built environment, we often think about infrastructure lasting 50 to 80 years. Looking outside, clearly we have infrastructure that lasts a lot longer than that. But over that time period, we know there's tremendous uncertainty from many sources. And so how we manage that uncertainty, making decisions today, we can't wait, but also making decisions that are going to be resilient to possible futures that we don't yet see. And so we need infrastructure that is financed and maintained and resilient and effective over that whole time period. And that's a tall task. So our best opportunity of success, too, is tremendous engagement with the stakeholders, because they're the ones that are going to help understand the problem. Obviously, depending on where you sit, literally, you can have different perspectives, and ensuring that infrastructure provides the services we seek to the people we're hoping to serve. So one framing thing I would also mention, too, is that the work we've done suggests that for the highest risk hazards, it's not often just nature. The idea is that hybrid infrastructure, which is a combination of built and natural, often is more effective at mitigating risks than either natural or built on their own. So that's going to be a frame. I think it's not going to be either or, it's often going to be both. So some of the engineers I talk to say, well, green where you can, gray where you must. And I think it might be the two together. But the question is, well, where can you green? Where can you where can you use nature-based solutions? I had the chance to work for a time at the White House leading work on nature-based solutions, and one of the things we wanted to do was combine the perspectives of academia, right, that does the hard, long, rigorous work, which is incredibly important, with the perspectives of practitioners. Because, right, the academic research is a bit of a lagging indicator. It takes time to get published. I mean, those of you that do it know that well. There's people putting these things in the ground every single day. So we tried to bring these two together. And what we did was we looked at 23 nature-based solutions. They're the rows in this chart. And we tried to evaluate, if you combine those two sources of information, which ones work best for different hazards. We looked at a range of hazards that kind of go from pluvial flooding, riverine flooding, all the way to extreme heat and some water quality outcomes. And the table behind you, where there's a 0 or it's white, that just means there's no interaction. That particular nature-based solution doesn't really do anything for that hazard. The dark green ones are the interesting ones, because what those mean is that those have potential. Now, as all of you know, location and local context matters. So this is not to say that for any particular project, a floodplain is able to reduce the risk of riverine flooding. But what it does say is if you're considering infrastructure to reduce any of these hazards, there is a nature-based solution that is a candidate. you should consider these as being on your short list. And then, of course, you do need to do more information to look at this in detail to see, in your circumstance, does it work for you? But for every hazard we looked at, there was at least one nature-based solution, and sometimes many. So one just general consideration before getting into like the challenges and opportunities. I suspect much of the conversation today is going to be about countries like the United States or Europe, high-income countries. Developing countries where I work face even greater challenges. The amount of infrastructure they require to grow their economies and reduce poverty is truly massive. These countries also have less access to finance, technical capacity than we ourselves do in our countries. And nature-based solutions are growing in these countries, but they still are able to close only a small gap. And these countries, then how can we also, in developing countries, increase their capacity to manage the same risks that we ourselves are facing? So, starting off with the good news. The first challenge is building confidence that nature-based solutions work. And one of the bits of good news that you're familiar with is there's a lot of great research. Looking at you, Jairo, some of the people in this room have done the leading research that's demonstrated that looking at the breadth of the academic research, the majority of projects assessed were effective in mitigating hazards using nature-based solutions. And in fact, they can be more effective than a gray solution. So the research has helped us have that academic foundation that we're on a good path. There's a lot of work going on. I will also mention that performance data is something that also is important. One university that's working on this is Duke. And at Duke, they're trying to come up, especially for coastal and wetland areas, a set of metrics so that we can be more consistent in how we monitor and evaluate nature-based solutions, so we can learn not just from individual projects, but like in a more meta collective way. They're also trying to facilitate a database where information from different projects could be available, as well as a network of researchers that can work together on some of those shared challenges so we can learn faster. There's a lot of interesting work done too on how do we do good risk management and how do we communicate it. One example is Brian Bledsoe at the University of Georgia, talking about how we need to both, ensure we look at the big risks, the ones that show up on the front page of the newspapers, but also the smaller risks, because those over time can be really important and they're more frequent. One idea I like too that Brian's mentioned is we often think about return periods like 1 in 100-year floods. Now, all of you know that one challenge there is the old 1 in 100 is not necessarily accurate today. But another challenge is not everybody thinks about things in 100-year periods. So if I've done the math right, a 1 in 100-year flood is about a 16% risk over 30 years. 30 years is a useful time to think about in the United States, at least, because many people have a mortgage for their home, which is 30 years. So you're kind of getting to people at a time scale that matters to them. And if we can do that, that just helps meet decision makers where we are. And that's probably a common theme that we're all working on. Engineers need confidence that they're on a good path when they sign off on something. They have a liability requirement, and that's a challenge for new ideas. So the Army Corps of Engineers has done some good work on like flood risk, and there's an international guideline that you can look at, which is an example of being able to provide some structure in terms of a process to manage those risks, so engineers can feel like they're doing something that's a validated process that's going to get them to a good place. A challenge we all face, though, is quantifying performance, right? It's important from an engineering perspective because you want to know how your infrastructure performs. And from an insurance perspective, you want to know what your insured losses could be. A challenge is that oftentimes we just don't have that localized information. So what can we do to fill that gap? One of the questions I don't have the answer to, but I'm looking to sort of build on with all of you is, is there a qualitative opportunity to scale up here where we can really leap forward, harnessing the vast amounts of data which are currently available to us, through remotely sensed data, often that has decades of historical records? How can we use the new tools available to us, machine learning and others, to draw signals out of that enormous amount of data? And how can we meet decision makers where they are? Because they can't all analyze that data. How do we do a better job of, whether it's a municipal manager trying to decide what to do about zoning or someone else, how do we meet people where they are with this information in a way that makes more people make more decisions that are informed than we do today? So the second challenge is incentivizing use. How do we draw on those incentives? One way of doing that is just making this more normal. The American Society of Civil Engineers is the largest association of professional engineers and the oldest in the United States. And what's really interesting is this is an engineering association for engineers. And they have a policy on nature-based solutions. And that policy says that their goal is to integrate the built and the natural to reduce hazards, as well as provide those other benefits, economic, social, and natural, that infrastructure can provide. They're helping norm this by making it part of the job of an engineer. So it's not just like a conservation organization, but it's an engineering association. And they play a central role in codes and standards and other things in the United States. So this is a helpful development. Another policy I find interesting is we can't say that any one context, a nature-based solution, is the way to go. But the Army Corps of Engineers, that in my country does a lot of investments in sort of water infrastructure, has a policy that says, when you're looking at alternatives, one of them should have nature or natural features in it. It's just to say, at the very beginning of the project, make sure one of the choices you're looking into includes this, and then evaluate it. And if it works or should be part of the solution, great. If it doesn't, that's fine. But don't forget to do this. I think policies like that at upstream early in the process, because sometimes if we think about just doing the things the way we've always done them, we won't necessarily incorporate benefits of all of this are key, especially how they're integrated in cost-benefit analysis. And given that we have a great session on this tomorrow, I'm not going to go into depth. I look forward to that conversation. But how we can do a better job of quantifying the economic benefits, including them in the cost-benefit analyses that inform so many decisions, and also including them in sort of the models, like the CAT models and others that we use, is going to be essential. One incentive also could be that nature-based solutions can be less costly to maintain. Many have some potential for self-repair. They could grow or adapt over time, something that gray infrastructure cannot do. And they can also fail gracefully rather than failing catastrophically. So these are all potential incentives for nature-based solutions. But a sidebar, a challenge is that the kind of maintenance they require may not be the capacity that a particular jurisdiction already has installed. This could be something new. So we've got a little bit of a mismatch here, but it is an incentive that could help us. Now, a third challenge, my last bin of challenges, is barriers. Like, what's holding us back? Permitting. Permitting in the United States is a huge challenge because it can be harder to permit a nature-based solution than a gray one. It takes more time and it takes more money. The Environmental Policy and Innovation Center has done some interesting work, and they found that just permitting before you build anything can consume 30% of the budget for a nature-based solution, 30%. So we need to change that. Now, the reasons are varied. It can be a range of inflexible institutions that are not used to doing this. It might involve different agencies that struggle to coordinate. You add nature-based solutions and all of a sudden you need more permits, more approvals. It could be outdated ways of assessing risk and doing things. And ironically, it could also be a challenge that we hold them to a very high standard. The environmental impact assessment process was designed to avoid bad things from happening. So it's kind of a precautionary approach. Now, some of these nature-based solutions, they actually reduce risk. They don't add to it, but we kind of maintain that very high bar for implementation. So it's very hard to implement these things. If we really want to scale up, the Environmental Policy Innovation Center says really we need to be able to permit these things within 90 days if it's a commonly understood and approved or a commonly known nature-based solution. Maybe a year for a complex project, but it cannot be the status quo where it can be 4 or 5 years just to get permission to start work. Another challenge that, or a barrier that remains, right, is that nature is not in insurance models. And I really am excited about having conversations to learn more about what we can do to overcome that. As you know, there's been great studies. One I'm sharing there is with Munich Re and the Nature Conservancy that was looking at levee setbacks, basically moving levees further away from a river to create more space. And they found that, yes, you can integrate the benefits of these nature-based solutions into the insurance models. And in fact, it could result in a 20% reduction in the avoided losses. So it can be done, but it's still not being done at scale. So this is a scale question as well. And I've also found the work being done by the Environmental Defense Fund on insurance. And we have a couple colleagues, Will and Guillaume, here with us today. Interesting as well. And there we're interested in some of the ideas that I found interesting is even with reductions in premiums, we're still going to need those public investments. But insurance could provide a good directional signal to where that public investment should go. So I'm interested in learning how, the insurance is the tip of the spear in terms of risk management, skin in the game. How can that be a signal then for public investment? Whether that's public investment in terms of the underlying science, because a lot of that is federally funded, or public investment in terms of the infrastructure where we put things. And how can we then use that as a signal to ensure that we still do the public, because that's going to still be required. So I'm just going to wrap up that there is a huge challenge that we face in terms of developing the infrastructure that we all need. It's got to live for 50, 80 years or more. It's got to be financed, maintained, resilient, and effective. And nature should be a part of that. So how we do that is a central challenge. But to scale up, we need to overcome some things. We need to build confidence that they work. We need to harness the incentives to scale rapidly, and we also need to remove some of these barriers. So in the coming days, I'm very interested in learning from all of you and trying to connect people and ideas. I look forward to talking to you, but also please feel free to reach out. And I'm hoping that this is the beginning of good collaborations to come. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Doc. I mean, you brought us to the level, exactly the working starting point for our future discussion. So we are going a little bit into the time of the next session, but Doc is going to stay with us until the end, and all the topics that he touched upon we will be discussing in length. So I would now perhaps hand over to Priscila to introduce our chair for the next session, and thank you very much, Doc.
For this very elucidative, insightful presentation. I would like now to invite to the stage my colleague and Paula Lefori, please. She will be moderating the next panel. And I would also invite already panelists to join here, or you invite them one by one?
Yeah, stage. I see Romain coming on stage. He works for DG Environment in the European Commission in the Green Finance and Green Investment Unit. We have Maria Fuentes Merino, a colleague from DG AGRI, working on CAP instruments. We have Albena Taneva from DG GROW, working on access to finance. Then we have Tsevetelina Kuzmanova from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And last but not least, we have Matteo Vanzini from Climate Kick, an innovative finance specialist. Welcome. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the very first panel of the NATURANCE Festival. Our role is a little bit to set the scene for the next couple of days by taking a closer look at the policy landscape for financing nature in the European Union. And we will be looking at EU initiatives that are intended to promote investment in nature. And we have no shortage of strategies, policies, political commitments even, but it remains difficult to translate them into funding at the scale and at the pace that we actually need. Biodiversity loss and climate risks are accelerating dramatically, yet funding for nature and nature-based solutions is still fragmented. It's very slow to deploy, and it's often hard to access on the ground. So with this panel, we're going to do three things, essentially. First, we will take stock of the current policy and funding instruments. Second, we'll head at what is changing in the near future. And third, we will ask the more difficult question, which is, how can we do better than we are currently doing? So our panelists are closely involved in some of the EU key funding and policy tools, from nature credits to cap eco schemes to InvestEU, and also in the shaping of the next EU budget. So with three colleagues from the European Commission, each approaching the issue from a different angle, as we said. And then we have two speakers who are going to offer an external perspective on the strengths and limitation of the current policies, and also suggest maybe how we can look at the future. So we will start with the first round of very short presentations, and I will invite you to stick to the 5 minutes allocated, please, and then we will dive deeper into the topic. And we start with Romain.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me? Yes, wonderful. Thank you. So I'll say a few words from DG Environment, starting by the picture of how much we're actually spending, right? Because this is the first good news, let's say, looking at the multi-annual financial framework, the ongoing one. We've had a step up, right, into the financing of biodiversity and nature. If you can go to the second page. And so this is what the beautiful pie chart that you can see here, right? Around 112 billion being spent on nature and biodiversity on this specific MFF, mostly from CAP, as you can see in dark blue, but also cohesion funds, the Life Fund, Horizon, and so on. And I'm sure my colleagues from DG AGRI and DG GROW will say more on how much is coming from that. But of course, this is not enough, right? And from the most recent environmental implementation review of 2025, we know that we have a shortage of around 37 billion annual in the EU. And if you zoom out and you look at the overall world, it's much more, right? And you can see here around 700 billion in gap. And so in a state of constrained fiscal space and conflicting priorities, we know that we need to mobilize much more from the private side, right? And insurance equally. If you can go to the next slide. And so looking at what has worked well and worked a bit less well in our funding system, looking at InvestEU, NCFF, if you're familiar with the Natural Capital Financing Facility and so on, we've been working on multiple topics to enable the regulatory framework. Redirecting environmental harmful subsidies, of course, if you look at payment for ecosystem services, fiscal incentives, and so on. Partnership with financial institutions, so we're working really closely with EIB, EIF, and other national and promotional banks on blending finance, guarantee, co-investment, and so on, but also market-based instrument. That's why you can see here, including nature credits. And so I'm sure you'll have seen that with keen attention. In July 2025, we came out with the roadmap towards nature credit, a communication that sets out a bit the ongoing work in 2025, 2026, 2027 to come up with a regulatory framework, or proposing something that makes sense and that could provide a bit of security to the market. If you can go to the next slide. And so here are the different actions that you can see in the roadmap. And if I group them, there is a big action around an expert group that has been set up now. It has had its first meeting in December, and it is tasked in providing criteria, methodologies from across the market, academia, and so on, to nourish the thinking there. There's also been the launch of a pilot funding program that is aimed at beefing up the different actions on the ground that will come together to create this market. And you can see that other topics are coming up also with the CSRF carbon farming method, with biodiversity co-benefits, for example, in 2026. So multiple actions that are aimed to provide this security. And maybe my last slide so that I can stick to my 5 minutes. Here are a bit where there are different action points where I invite you all to take part of it, right? The first one is participating to the consultation on the natural restoration plans. This is very important because this will feed into the next MFF that we'll talk a bit about later on the national and regional partnership plans. The NRPs, the restoration plans, will be a key component there. Following the work of the expert group, this will be very important, and there is an opportunity to keep to join the group when there are open calls happening. You can see the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform. I'm sure you're familiar with it. The different technical assistance elements that can be done with projects, and so Green Assist and the EIB advisory hubs are concrete ways to work on project preparation, which is really important. Apply to funding. There will be calls by LIFE, Horizon, Interreg, and others linked towards nature credits and other biodiversity actions that you can take part on. And of course, the next MFF that we'll talk a bit more about in a minute. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sticking to the 5 minutes. We move on to DG Grow, and I'll pass the mic to Maria.
I'm not from DG Grow. It doesn't matter. So yeah, I work in the a department called Environmental Sustainability in the Director General who manage the Common Agricultural Policy. And you can go to the next slide. So here I will be really taking the topic of agriculture and who is a sector who really works with the nature, not always in the right way. So it's a dual role, providing really ecosystem services, but also impacting the waters and the soil and the biodiversity. And this slide is just to show in an image what we are expending in the Common Agricultural Policy for agro-environmental and climate support. So improving farming practices, changing farming models to more environmental sustainability. And these are the two squares in green. So we have currently two main tools, the eco schemes and the agro-environmental and climate measures, with the same objective but slightly different rules. And these together represent today almost 30% of the total Common Agricultural Policy, which is a substantial contribution. In terms of area is the bar figure. So you will see also the area covered by these two instruments, and on EU average is the green bar. So the eco schemes have been run in around 58% of the European agricultural area, and the agro-environmental measures in 10% on EU average, though in several countries this coverage is much more important, as you may see in these graphs. So I say this is well, you can go to the next one. Not to stay longer, I leave this for you. This is in terms of what we call the results indicators we have in the different CAP strategic plans, and this is the realization in the first year, just to convey the message that what member states have planned in terms of use of these funds for environmental measures have been used. So member states have keep path with what they have planned. So of course this does not mean that this is all perfect, and the level of ambition and scope of these measures are different according to the member states and also the environmental objectives. You can go to the next one, I think. This is really in a very short way. What we have today is roughly what the two tools I have mentioned, and then what we have proposed for the future. So, as my colleague said, the Commission presented in July of past year a proposal for the next, what we call the next programming period is 28-34. So we propose the budget. For the really this was this is a quite ambitious proposal in terms of governance. So with the creation of a national and regional partnership fund that will gather a lot of the current fund streams to try to really achieve a more integrated programming across the different areas. And the common agricultural policy will be integrated in this common fund. So this has been quite a catharsis in the EU, but we continue with this plan. Of course, we need to work now with the member states and with the European Parliament to really improve this proposal. And roughly what we propose for the CAP is to continue with a minimum set of rules, minimum set of protective practice that the member state will define, and so continue with the support to farmers for improving the farms methods, the farm practices, and the farms models in a more holistic way, with one single instrument, which is the agro-environmental and climate actions. To cover these priorities, and this is the last slide, you can, yeah, exactly. And this is the environmental and climate priority areas for which the regulation we have proposed asks the member states to provide support in the future national and regional partnership agreements. So I think I stay here, and then we can, of course, discuss more on this.
Thank you very much.
Now grow.
Is this working now? Yes. Yes, now Albena, who is actually from DG Grow. Thank you very much.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. I'm indeed coming from a long named DG, but the short name is DG Grow, and this is the Director General of the Commission responsible for the internal market. So I will talk about the future, and I will talk about competitiveness. So an approach that we can also support nature-based solutions, but looking at how all these investments can contribute within the overall objective of boosting EU's competitiveness. So for the future, as my AGRI colleague mentioned, we have the next multi-annual financial framework coming, 2028-2034. In July last year, the Commission put forward a very ambitious package of various programs, and one of these is the so-called European Competitiveness Fund. So it will complement what was just presented and refer to the national and the regional partnership plans. where all the cohesion funds, agricultural funds, fisheries funds, etc., they come within a single pot. And we will have another fund combining 14 EU-level programs that are active in the current MFF and support many, many things. And as you will see on one of the next slides, please. So why do we combine 14 programs? Because we have had anecdotal evidence, and that was also alluded to in the Letta report and the Draghi report on the EU competitiveness, that we have a lot of programs, but they often lack coherence. So we have a lot of instruments with different eligibility criteria, with different what we call one-stop shops, and we have many of these scattered around. So companies very often, they find difficulties in making their way where to find financing. And also we lack a coherent single instrument to finance the single investment journey of a company. Also, we often lack flexibility because the different instruments, they are pre-financed, they have different rules, and we don't have one coherent set of rules. And we also have the problem of value of death, where we are financing a lot of innovative companies in Europe, but once they need to scale up, they often go to the US or to other places, and the good innovation that is conceived in Europe doesn't stay with us. Next slide, please. So as a result of all this evidence, the Commission for the next MFF has proposed the European Competitiveness Fund. I will not bother you with concrete figures, but we have the overall capacity of a bit more than 450 billion euros. Which comes from the ESF itself, but also from Horizon Europe, 175 billion euros, where we will work very closely with its competitiveness pillar, and we are also drawing funding from the Innovation Fund. And with this ambitious budget, we aim to leverage private and other public financing in the EU economy in the next 7 years, and to achieve investments reaching close to 2 trillion euros. Next slide, please. The key features of the Competitiveness Fund is, I mentioned the scale. So we are really pooling quite considerable resources. We also want to deliver impact by really addressing key policy priorities for the EU and key areas where market alone cannot sufficiently finance. We want to finance the seamless investment journey of companies from the very early conceptual phase of innovation to the deployment of their products, to the scaling up of the companies, to have a one-stop shop that really, with simplified rules and single rule book, can accompany the company's financing journey, be it for grants, be it for equity financing, for lending, for blended finance, for venture debt. So every company has particular needs. We want to ensure policy coherence by bringing everything under one single roof and having common rules. And last but not least, we want to be also agile and to be really able to react to changing circumstances, because nobody can predict in this unstable world today, and also geopolitical challenges, what can happen over the next years and where EU financing could be needed. Next slide. The Competitiveness Fund architecture, very briefly, there are two of the policy windows which are relevant for nature-based solutions. One is definitely clean transition and industrial decarbonization. We also have a dedicated window on health, biotech, agriculture, and bioeconomy. It is combining a lot of priorities under one single roof, but definitely agricultural investments will complement the common agricultural policies investments in the next MFF. And we also, I think it was referred to, the InvestEU instrument, which is very active in the current MFF as a budgetary guarantee to underpin lending and equity support in the EU economy. That will continue to exist also in the next MFF and help attract private and public financing. Next slide. Yeah, I think I can already pass the colleague the microphone, but happy to reply to your questions after that.
Thank you. Yes, over to you, Tsevetelina.
Thank you, Paula. I don't know how you managed to get 2 Bulgarians on the panel. Well done. My name is Tsevetelina Kuzmanova. I'm part of the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Yes, I've used the NATURANCE branding, maybe just to say and shout out to my colleagues, Jonathan and Corinne, who arrived this morning from Cambridge and a part of the NATURANCE team. But I'm based here in Brussels. We have a small office here working specifically on sustainability, policy-related sustainability. And my focus is finance. And we work, we convene a group of companies, corporates, called Corporate Leaders Group Europe, which represents some of the big European companies who consider themselves and pride themselves to be on the forefront of sustainability and to offer some of these solutions that I want to show you today as well. And again, working with them to move the needle on policy a little bit for these solutions to become more mainstream. And also this morning, by the way, I heard from another Commission colleague that regulation cannot work on itself. It has to come from a place of examples, positive stories, and what works for businesses as well. So if we go on the next slide, I want to show you some examples on what we work on. But generally in my intervention, I want to zoom out a little bit and to present how the frameworks work and are conducive, where the gaps are currently. So this is a little bit more on the real economy, on the policy, on the business side. And after that, I will go into some of the finance framework for investing in these. I wanted to show you this. It's specifically for nature-based carbon removals. But it's a publication that will come up next week. But we have worked with businesses to draft, to come up with these 10 principles on what constitutes credible solution. And the reason I'm saying this is because from our experience working with companies, a lot of times they invest on their own and they're ready to move, but we need to make sure that the solutions are credible, science-based, consistent, and are informing also the policy framework. So in a lot of these solutions, already some policy frameworks already exist, but we currently, for instance, for this specifically, we lack the credible framework. And just to give you a couple of examples, the first one is something that I'm very proud of in Europe. That's something that Europe, I think, is doing very well. This is the additionality to mitigation action. The reason I'm saying this is because ESRS, for instance, the reporting standards, Europe is one of the few places that has sort of rooted in legislation the fact that when a company looks at their decarbonization and transition trajectory, this should be an add-on, a complementary action on top of their mitigation actions. And especially now that we are having conversation around nature credits, achieving the 2040 targets with flexibilities through international credits, I think this is very important, and I think this is something that Europe is doing very well. Some examples here come naturally, I think, to some of the people here in the room, but believe me, when it comes to policy, especially the politics, it's not so evident. So for instance, the science-based approach, I think this is the third alignment with science. That is not necessarily a given, so just to consider this. And we do have also some specific principles around transparency and disclosures. I know that this is politically probably a little bit toxic conversation in Europe in the moment. We are in this whole cycle of taking a step back with the simplification and frankly, deregulation type of practices. But it's still, I want to say that it's still transparency and disclosure are quite relevant. I hope in our discussion that we can go into some of the details of what is happening specifically on the nature side of things. So the bottom line here is that businesses are ready and moving. We need to make sure that this is credible and the policies credible and science-based and consistent in order for finance to be able to scale up, especially on the private side of things, and policy predictability. I want to reiterate this because now we are again in the cycle of changing policies all the time. If we go to the next slide, I want to show you some of the, we're missing three. We're missing three squares there. I don't know what happened. I wanted to show you here some of the financing tools that are rooted in the sustainable finance framework. So here I have listed the 6 climate and environmental objectives of the EU. And the one that I wanted to showcase here, the last one is currently missing, is the biodiversity one. Europe has already made a lot of progress in creating the policies for creating the tools and instruments to finance some of this. So I have listed the EU taxonomy, for instance, which is the cornerstone of investment instruments such as the EU green bond standards, and it's very much linked to investor disclosures in their portfolios, green investments, green financial instruments. But Europe looks at these objectives in a holistic way. You're either taxonomy aligned or not taxonomy aligned. So it doesn't distinguish between, in your portfolio, it doesn't distinguish between renewable energy and nature solutions. So it's only marginal for me how nature is currently incorporated. So there are only 2 activities from a very long list of what is considered green in Europe. I have listed them here. The first one is very broad: conservation, including restoration of ecosystems. The other one is a lot more specific. It's focusing on hotels and camping grounds. So there is a lot more work to be done on agriculture, for instance, that is currently missing, and a politically very difficult conversation, but this is a part of how the system needs to improve the framework. Similar for the forests as well. So there, from a biodiversity and nature solutions, there are a lot more opportunities here. And just to say that from an investor perspective, the usability is probably a little bit limited, precisely because there's no distinction between the different activities in your portfolio. And naturally, well, not necessarily naturally, but it's easier for an investor to go after renewable energy projects rather than nature-based projects as well. If we can go to the next slide, I wanted to also touch base on some of the public finance instruments and some that have already been mentioned. I think especially that a lot of nature-based solutions are not necessarily bankable, investable right now. So they definitely need the support of public finance. From the NATURANCE projects, I have learned you need to always distinguish between funding and financing. But I think we have done a lot of progress, and I think the ECF InvestEU instruments, which Albena mentioned, is quite significant here because we are moving a little bit more, not only in subsidizing, but in blended finance instruments. So Europe has recognized that this is something that is working, and we will be doing a lot more of that. Here I want to mention just the caveats. I'm also very supportive of bulking different instruments, different EU projects, different EU funds together. But for the moment, we are also missing specific targets on nature and biodiversity, for instance. Similar reason to what I mentioned, you might end up these funds cannibalizing more renewable energy or other more attractive investments to cannibalize a little bit the more nature focus. And just to give you an example, in the current EU budget that we are currently in, it was 7.5% of the budget in 2024, and for the current period is like 10% for biodiversity. In the next MFF, currently it's a target for all 6 climate and environmental objectives: mitigation, adaptation, water prevention, pollution prevention and control. How many do we have? Circular economy, and the last one is biodiversity. Exactly. Just to mention this, similarly with the LIFE program, which was the only dedicated place in the current budget on climate and biodiversity, it will now be part of the European Competitiveness Fund. So we need to make sure that we also have these safeguards, that the money is going to the right targets as well. I will end on that note. I'm sure that we will continue the conversation and we'll go in more details on some of these.
Thank you very much. And we pass the mic now to Matteo, our last panelist. Thank you, Matteo.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to bring a bit of a different perspective, but touching on some of the points mentioned as more of a practitioner that is trying to structure investment into nature-based solution. If we can go. So I think it's important to just give a bit of a background about myself and my work in the context of this. My background is in innovative finance, but for international development. And as I started increasingly focus on climate and nature, and in particular agri-food and fiber systems, I naturally moved to work exclusively in Europe for one reason or another. In my current role at Climate Kick, I was hired to lead on the finance work of our deep demonstration project with the Irish government, the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. That was very much looking at transitioning agri-food system to meet the country climate targets. We are applying our methodology on system transformation, but when it comes to financing, it was very much about how can we coordinate the different pots of money and instruments available. Something around systemic investment that the colleagues at TransCap Initiatives are developing now, but that could just go so far. And I think there is a realization that this quite top-down approach, the system will not change just because there is a kind of an architecture on top that is trying to push towards a strategy. We needed to find ways to fund the innovators, the system changer, much more place-based, much more locally driven. So that's why we started working on the Place Finance Lab, which is now taking most of my time, very much working with the business community, whether they're farmers, processors, and trying to identify what are those projects that still fit in our portfolio systemic intervention, but can very much show how the new agri-food and fiber system, in our case, could look like. And we're doing this type of work in a smaller region of Ireland, so Cork and Tipperary counties, as well as Cornwall and Devon in the UK. And I'm going to bring just the two lessons learned from this work, very much about place-based financial innovation. If we go to the next slide, please. So it was mentioned about blended finance and how can we work with different instruments, one catalyzing one another. So these are three examples that in Ireland could work together, and there is increasing interest in making them work together. And it emerges the private sector, Bank of Ireland, a high street bank, SBCI, so Strategic Banking Corporation Ireland, which is ultimately what InvestEU or the European Investment Bank could play as a role, so de-risking investments of private lenders, as well as CAP. And I brought a couple of examples there, but ultimately, if a farmer can access a CAP instruments, can get a sustainable linked loan from a private bank, and that those loans are guaranteed by a development finance institution, well, then you start seeing that it's not just about blending finance of compiling different instruments, but it's also about improving the overall business case for farmers in this case, which sometimes are asked to do things like the Irish government has this marginal abatement curve that says those are very good things you could do, but they're cost negative for you, so find a way to get incentivized. And so those are the kind of things that we were looking at, and it's very interesting to see Bank of Ireland doubling down on sustainable linked loans. there are others in Ireland being done. We see SBCI doubling down on those de-risking and try to not only de-risk other lenders, but now start lending activities themselves. And with the new cap, we still need to see what's going to happen, but those instruments are overly subscribed. Like TAMS, the one I included there, it was greatly appreciated by the farmers. So this is an example of how those different instruments can work together. If we go to the next slide, thank you. Which wants to address more of an issue of natural capital, nature credits, from my perspective, trying to bring results-based financing mechanism, which is, if you only focus on the frameworks to develop projects that generate those credits without starting from building the markets, building the demand, you will end up like the UK seems to be going, where the net biodiversity gain was a great initiative. There was lots of interest. Developers were keen. Landlords and estate managers were keen to develop those projects. There is just not enough demand. And when it comes to those type of projects, the investments we are looking at, which are very much from on-farm intervention to what we call, and TIFs in the US is called the missing middle infrastructures, to the systemic portfolio of investments. Those are key aspects. And I think oftentimes this is another kind of inputs to the conversation. We focus a lot on the capital side and financing interventions, and perhaps not paying enough attention to building sustainable business model and focusing on the revenue side. So when we look at this natural credit, carbon credit, biodiversity credits, all the credits, we need to focus on stimulating the demand, creating the markets, and compiling those outcomes together. So the approach we're taking both in Ireland and in the UK, very much focusing on carbon farming in livestock. Dairy is massive. Water quality is a big problematic in both countries, is taking the example of the social or development impact bonds, which have nothing to do with the green bonds and the more corporate bond structures, outcome-based contracts. Can we create a pool of outcomes, verify them, and sell this to a pool of outcome funders? Indeed, in an effort of generating the demand for those outcomes. So this from the UK is not a European context, but I definitely think highly relevant for this discussion we're having today, and some additional food for thoughts for our discussion.
Thank you very much, Matteo. I love how you brought us more on the ground level by bringing concrete examples. We've stayed pretty much high level with the rest of the panel, but with your presentation, we went a little bit deeper. We're a little bit short on time, so I'm almost tempted to skip the first question I had, but I still think it's important that we dive a little bit deeper into an analysis and so taking exercise of what's worked so far and what hasn't. And Maria hinted at that in her presentation on the cap, and which instruments could move significantly more capital but haven't, and why is that? Where are there obstacles that we need to remove? Are there components that are still missing and need to be added? It would be nice to have, a very open, almost speculative conversation around this. Who wants to start? Maybe Maria with the.
Yeah, the question is really broad. For agriculture, despite the fact that so the cap has been there for many years, and also the specific support for the agro-environmental measures, and despite the fact that I think that, and we can data show that the environmental performance has improved. I know that we haven't met the expectations. There are still challenges in the biodiversity, there's still water pollution, too much pesticides use, soil degradation, etc. But well, we continue the approach to really provide support for farmers, provide incentives and not only rules. But really incentives. But we realize that the money, the premium they can get is not sufficient. There is much more knowledge-based building in so that the farmers believe that, for instance, having landscape elements, spaces for nature in their area is not only for the birds and is also for them. So it's for their own interest in fighting against pests, for instance, also preventing soil erosion, many things. I see, for instance, several countries that have foreseen quite a lot of important support for agroforestry, for instance. So one issue on which the research is confident that provides many environmental and benefits also for the farming itself, but this does not really take up sufficiently. So because, of course, it's progressing, but not at the scale it should, because many farmers still consider that these rows or trees in the middle of the fields are really disturbing. And so what needs is really, I think, more also knowledge-based to really, and also to show, is what the keynote speaker said at the beginning, to really provide them more data on the economic benefits that, for instance, the landscape elements provide. That this is not only a cost, a harm, something that is really prevent the machine, but also provides economic benefits for them. And this, I think there are progress, and this is why research projects are important to really provide the case that, for instance, the landscape elements provide also economic benefits for the farmer, not only for the birds, which is already good, of course, but also for them, for their activity, for their profitability, because it's what the farmers really understand. And believe me, there is a big case of really lack of profitability in the EU agriculture. So.
Thank you, Maria. This reminds me of somebody this morning said nature is not a liability, it's an asset. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Does anyone else want to chip in? Albena, please.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about InvestEU in the current programming period, because we mentioned it a couple of times. And we have some good experience and probably some areas which need to be improved. So one of the many things my unit is doing, we are also the policy chair of the SME window of InvestEU. And then we work very much with the banking sector, with the European Investment Fund in Luxembourg, because by their statute they support SMEs. And when the current MFF started, we were thinking, what products can we do for SMEs, financial products, that are oriented towards sustainability? Because we have a lot of products on competitiveness, to improve access to financing generally, because SMEs, they often face barriers. They are asked very high collateral for their projects, or they are simply not financed because the banking sector sees them as very risky. We have products for innovation of SMEs, because also innovative ones, they often lack collateral because they don't have the tangible assets. But the question mark was, what can we do about sustainability? And Tsevetelina mentioned the taxonomy. So we looked at the taxonomy, on the climate and environmental sides for the 6 environmental and climate objectives. But our feeling was that we have a lot of criteria to define what is green there and what is sustainable, but this is not necessarily the type of financing that SMEs are asking the banking sector to support. So on this basis, we worked with the European Investment Fund to do some criteria. And today we have a product which is called Sustainability Guarantee. And one of the things we can support is indeed biodiversity and nature-based solutions. And that is the good news. But the challenge actually came when we had to find projects from the companies to be financed, because normally banks looked at projects which are bankable, so they need to be revenue generating, and not always biodiversity investments are revenue generating. So indeed, a lot of the support, and probably that's one of the lessons learned, went to green cars, so zero emission vehicles, putting solar panels on the roof of the companies, changing their equipment with more energy saving equipment, but a relatively small portion of our funding goes to biodiversity. So we would really need to work with the communities to explain better what are the advantages, because also not always these are easy projects to finance. I mean, the banking sector, they have to have the expertise and knowledge and even people inside to be able to assess these projects. It's not that I go and buy an electric vehicle, then I give the invoice. That's not that simple. So that would be a challenge to definitely look at for the future, also in the context of the Competitiveness Fund and what we can do to improve things. Thanks.
Thank you. And building on that, because that's something that we've worked quite a bit within DG Environment also, is understanding from our current demand-driven instruments. So basically, it depends on the demand of the financial intermediaries on this, and why they are potentially less successful than we would hope, especially for nature and biodiversity, because they are extremely successful for other topics on sustainability, especially decarbonization. And so when we talked to our implementing partners, what we hear, and that's nothing new to anybody in the room, I guess, is these projects are too few, too complicated, too risky, too small, and not revenue generating enough, right? So as a private institution or a para-public institution, I cannot really go there, especially if within InvestEU, I have other more attractive projects that I could finance at a lesser cost. And so what we had designed was exactly the natural capital financing facility, which was working with the EIB, a top-up from LIFE, to focus specifically on nature and biodiversity, hoping that without the competition from other projects, we could really finance those. And these still came back, right? That these projects, they couldn't really be financed because they were too few and because they weren't attractive enough, right? And so what we're learning from that is that, yes, there is a big push that needs to happen on the project pipeline. And what you were saying, Doug, at the beginning is very true of having more successful cases that we can put forward so that people can understand that it works and that there are more projects like that in the pipeline for people to finance. That's one, for sure. But there's also another topic, which is having more revenue enhancing mechanism like blending, having our grant portion working in tandem with that, and also financing potentially other type of intermediaries, like dedicated funds on biodiversity that could help scale or group aggregate these projects into one portfolio so that intermediaries could, at a lesser cost, target them. So there are multiple elements that we're thinking about, and hopefully in the next cast of MFF, we'll see what we can do about it.
Building on this point, you mentioned natural capital, and made me think something that you can see now in the market happening quite across Europe and the US and Australia is this private equity model applied to natural capital, very much as you were saying before, asset, you said nature as an asset. And I think that could be a bit dangerous because if you apply the method of private equity buying the land, appreciating the value, exiting the investment in 10 years, that will really not fit the bill in terms of the impact that we need to have. So if we think about it less in terms of an asset that I need to appreciate so that my return on investment is coming from exiting that investment, but more in terms of the services it provides, and therefore the point I mentioned before about revenue, if those services are monetized and it improves the revenue model, then the business case will be a more traditional one of an SMEs that is selling a product, that product has demand in the market, the lender is comfortable in giving money to these SMEs. And so while I'm kind of stressed enough, we need to focus on creating the demand and creating these markets. I also want to share with you like the approach we're taking, because outcome-based is very difficult. And sometimes we have some financial model that is like, oh, if we can get 150 euros a ton of carbon, it would be viable. And everybody's laughing at our face, like nobody will ever pay that. So can we, and this is something we're exploring now, but there is an interest, which I find it already quite a success, in can outcome be seen as a premium of a baseline payment just for the data, in our case, the farmer provides. So if we can reward the farmers to provide data about their soil, their activities, and that already ensure a bit of a revenue, then the outcome could be something on top of it. And overall, it improves the revenue model of those farmers. So by no means I want to say that this is already the solution, but it's really this relentless focus on building the markets, focus on the revenue, rather than just the financing side, the capital side, which I think has been proven problematic.
Thank you. I wanted to share also very quickly some data that we're getting from the first wave, the first years of implementing some of the EU finance instruments, and why specifically biodiversity is not as attractive for investors. Usually the solutions are local and small scale. And this is problematic for investors to even show up on their portfolio. So we need to start thinking of, either instruments or ways in bulking some of these, and in order to be more visible and more attractive to investors. So just as a side note. And finally, I wanted to have a bit of a call for action to link with our keynote presentation on risk and resilience, because nature, I think, has a very special role to play there. And Europe is also currently developing its resilience and adaptation framework, which will be announced in October, but it's also now currently open for a consultation, public consultation. Everyone here obviously cares about nature, and there is like a dedicated chapter for nature and proof points on nature, but also on insurance. And I know that we have a lot of insurers also in the room. So just to say, this is another opportunity where I think input is needed, proof points are needed, examples. And we also need to think of how we can best incorporate some of this in the resilience framework for the EU, although it will be more on a member state level, but obviously from a financing angle as well.
Thank you very much. Yes, I agree with you. We need to look at the integrated framework very, very closely. Also because honestly, it's the only place where nature is going to be mentioned as a separate item in the work program of the Commission for this year. So in a way, I think we need to find ways to embed nature into other discourses and narratives that are dominating the policy discourse right now. But I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, Tsevetelina, the stability of framework conditions, because predictability, as you said, is a key element in investment decision making. And when it comes to nature, investment even more, because it's by definition long term. So how do we balance out this tension between the need for change in our policy framework the need to provide some sort of stability of the conditions in which financial operators and investors work? It's a difficult question, I'm aware. Maybe.
Yeah. Since I got us here. I work a lot with the first movers and people on the forefront of implementing policies and investing a lot in implementing the policies, and not necessarily also seeing it from a compliance point of view. We shouldn't really look at all of this as a compliance exercise, but rather all the transparency, all the reporting, all the disclosure. When you think about it, it's a small but necessary piece of the puzzle of how we get there. In fact, from a lot of the corporates that I work with, they anecdotally keep saying you cannot change something you don't measure, something you cannot measure, or in the case of nature, assess rather than measure. So this is also one of the problems from the first wave of, changing the regulation with the whole omnibus processes. I'm currently, I recently became a member of the Platform on Sustainable Finance, so we're also specifically looking at the ESRS, European Sustainability Reporting Standards. We have a draft, but the Commission is yet to turn it into a delegated act, into law and into legislation. This is also one of the examples where I'm particularly worried about nature and biodiversity, because first of all, a lot of these things are very on a voluntary basis, and nature is not necessarily something you can easily quantify. And there has been this push to move from qualitative into more quantitative type of information that is useful for investors, for policymakers, for regulators. But obviously, you cannot necessarily quantify nature-related topics. And we also have some requirements on a voluntary basis for biodiversity nature transition plan. So not only your climate transition plan as a company, as an entity, but also with focus on biodiversity. So on a lot of this, we have a lot of changes, a lot of backtracking. So obviously from the first movers, this is a bit problematic from their stance. I also hear a lot from board of directors, we were the first to move on this. Now maybe we wait and see. We don't go until we know what's happening next. We don't move. We don't make the investments. We don't make the changes. We don't change our business operations. If you think about investment cycles, CapEx, especially for hard to abate sectors, is until 2050, we have how many investment cycles? 2 tops. So these are long-term investments that even businesses are making, not even from an investor perspective. So policy predictability is something that keeps coming up time and time again, that in order for them to be able to make these investments and these changes internally, they really need stable course, decide on it and stick to it. And we are currently in a situation where we are a bit revisiting. Politically, we need to revisit some of what we have done until now. So at least from my conversations with business and investors, that's a bit counterproductive if you're on the first mover wave.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else want to come in on this one?
This works. Thank you. No, I wanted to react because fully agree, right, that we do need predictability, and that's what is also asked from the market. I was thinking specifically on nature credits, and this is asked not only from the project promoters, who do require some clarity to move forward and to invest, and investors, of course, but also from the buy side, right? And you were very rightly highlighting that for a nature credit market to work, you need the full thing to work, right? It's not only investing into the piece of land, but it's also having a buyer on the other side and a market infrastructure that works and so on. And so that's what we are trying to move forward to with the roadmap that we shared, to be able to give to the market some clarity on where we want to move forward so that we have a high integrity market, right? Because what we also realize is that by moving too fast or by leaving the market completely open to it, we can also run, especially for a voluntary market like the carbon market, into issues of integrity, and we don't want to go towards greenwashing. So we want to, and that's why, again, I invite you all to take part to the expert group and what we are going to work on, because we want to capture all the input from the market and provide some clarity and some predictability so that it works.
Thank you very much. And I have a question that is a little bit linked to that, because I want to reverse the perspective a little bit. We've so far talked about the bottlenecks on the policy side, and there is often an assumption that that's where the main issues are. But shall we reverse the perspective and ask the panel, what can the private sector do to help policymakers chart the right course? And you've mentioned a very specific action that can be taken, but are there any other ideas of what the private sector can do for policymakers?
I think here I would like to mention our approach in Ireland, which started indeed with the government and very much systemic approach, and now we are moving into place-based, finding the innovators and trying to support them. And I think the best thing we could do is to find those projects that are going to show how the future system will look like. For example, what I think what was mentioned around moving because there is a signal from policy, I think it's definitely very important. But the conversation we're trying to have with those businesses is the viability of their business model once they start looking a bit further. Like in Ireland, they're promoting a specific breed of dairy cattle, and we ask if anyone had done some long-term assessment with the climate scenario on those breeds, and people freaked out. Like they were like, this is a very good idea, but we haven't. About grass availability in Ireland. Like there are things that are so embedded in their business models that we need to initiate the conversation. You're going to say the same thing to 10, 9 will not care, but 1 will. And that 1 is the farmer cooperative we're trying to work with in Cork County. They understand that their business model is at risk, that is the driver, that we can support a project that maybe one day will be looked as there was the seed of the new agri-food and fiber system. So if we can create robust, sound business propositions on the ground and finding those innovators, we're going to go support them. And if they're successful, they're going to give the signal to others in the private sector, more corporate level, the policy as well, because I'm sure that we are all rowing in the same direction. But the signals are both ways. And that's the approach we have taken after learning that on the other side, we were not as successful. So there is also a bit of self-criticism there. You know, this is a project that has been running for years. And now we're taking this. It's not going to be an easy ride, but we profoundly believe that that's how you change the system.
Thank you, Matteo. Any other ideas to share? Albena, please.
Yeah, I mean, the public sector should be seen as facilitator. I mean, that's our biggest challenge, to really be able to leverage resources and to not to crowd out the private market, but really target the financing where it's mostly needed. And talking about the ECF, the Competitiveness Fund, we have a very ambitious target of 43% on climate and the environment for the next MFF. And we'll have to deliver on that. So there is place for nature-based solutions. There is place for biodiversity support, but the role of the private sector would be really to help shape these investments, which are the most valuable, also from point of view of competitiveness, also from point of view of innovation, because we will very closely work with Horizon Europe. There is a lot of space for innovative ideas. So anything that is in this area with the potential for support will be greatly appreciated for picking up to finance, actually.
Thank you very much. Can I share a concern that I have, though, with this combined target for climate and biodiversity? The concern is that it's going to go towards what's easier to do and to measure. In other words, there is the risk that biodiversity and nature-based solutions, they're going to be swallowed a little bit by decarbonization, for example, which is much easier to sell politically in a way. It's easier to measure, and so on and so forth. So while I appreciate the good intention that's behind it, I have, big concerns about how that will turn out. And I don't know if you want to react to this immediately, but I felt the need to say that.
I mean, it also depends on the project preparation, because we talk about InvestEU, it's a demand-driven instrument. And we do rely on the due diligence of the banking sector to really pick up the projects. And I think it was already mentioned, it is of utmost importance to have a good bankable, sellable project to the banking sector so that they can pick it for financing, because we do agree with the banks, the framework. We give them the conditions. We say we will de-risk you if you finance investments in this or that particular area. But then the project selection does not depend on us. It is really on the private sector, on the project promoters, on the SMEs, on the companies to shape good, innovative, bankable, scalable ideas and to present them for funding.
If I may react to the point of the spending, right? Because I think what you said is very valid for InvestEU, but I think it's also a point of the overall MFF, the EU long-term budget, right? We have these 35% climate and environment spending target in there. And so it is correct that there isn't any more standalone biodiversity and nature target, but keep in mind that there was a climate target, right? And there was a biodiversity target, but they weren't linked before. And there was nothing on water, nothing on circularity, nothing on pollution. And so in this sense, bringing them together, yes, there is a bit of a risk that it is less clearly identified stream by stream. But I would highlight that when you look a bit in detail of the different regulations, they are within those, some specific objectives, some specific frameworks that are in place to make sure that nature is incorporated in different pillars in the national plans, but also in the ECF. But the other side is that it will probably allow us to have more continuity, flexibility, and also to target some areas that have more co-benefits. Right. So, for example, climate adaptation, there is an opportunity to also do nature-based solutions there. On water, it's especially important, right, to have these nature-based solutions in the realm of water and so on. So there is an opportunity to bring them together a bit more.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive answer to my concern. We'll come back to you in the future. And we can rediscuss now, but as I said, I understand the intention. I just have concerns. That's all. But I wanted to go back to something that you said several times. So the need to make the top-down and bottom-up approaches converge, and what roles the local authorities play in all this. Because so far we've touched on the EU level, a little bit on the national level, But there is then the lower level, the local and regional governments that play a huge role in implementations. And one of the concerns is, how do they access resources? How do they play their role in all of this?
Yeah. As you can imagine, I don't have the answer. Otherwise, I probably would be already very rich. I think that I see two things happening in the projects that we're looking at. So one, the other county I mentioned, Tipperary, is about building that bioeconomy infrastructure. So it's very much that missing middle piece of the puzzle. And there we are exploring farmer cooperatively owned small-scale biorefinery that later on would become part of a network of biorefinery owned by the farmers. So there you have the cooperative, the private sector is there, but the local authority see that as very much an economic development strategy. So that's also part of Ireland. It's peatlands. There used to be a massive mine of zinc, and that's part of a conversion process therein. So very much seeing the economic development upside and trying to mobilize as much resources as possible in that. On the other hand, related to the adaptation projects and nature-based solution, I think there is something around the resilient dividends aspects and avoided losses and the various benefits. Like when there were the floods in Valencia, straight away those local authorities realize of the cost. Now, the project that we are involved in with the 100 regions across Europe, which is Path to Resilience, part of the mission, there is still not that business case. So I don't believe is that easy. But if we can find, and possibly that's also like my framing of innovative finance, like I believe that we should structure different financial products. I generally don't believe in let's make the projects bankable, but let's not change how the capital flows. Like, that really didn't have massive impact in development markets where I kind of learned these things. So I think if we accept that we are going to change the financial products and the terms and conditions of those instruments, I think there is some room there to perhaps give some budget flexibility to those local authorities to invest today. Like ultimately, these are prevention schemes that in healthcare has already happened. So I think there are the seeds there, but it's either about preventing costs in the future or a very strong economic development narrative. Those to me are today the two most convincing levers that local authorities can use.
Thank you, Matteo. Tsevetelina, I don't know if you wanted to come in on this as well.
Maybe a little bit again from the governance and structure of the next EU budget. I know that there have been a lot of concerns around the national and regional partnership plans. And I'm, again, very much in favor in combining all of this and not having so many different programs and projects. But one of the main concerns is that now a lot of the decision-making about spending or different instruments will be in the hands of member states and will not be at the local regional level where things will be implemented. And one example that I can think of that I have been discussing with colleagues is, for instance, if you look at the case of Hungary, where you have the mayor of Budapest, who is more inclined to spend on green projects, while the country as a whole, member state level, is not necessarily going to invest in these solutions. You have this conundrum of how does a local or municipal level governance rely on these resources which will be spent at the member state level. And don't get me wrong, I'm very much in favor of this and having like a member state level accountability, because what is happening at the moment is we have overarching EU level targets for decarbonization, for nature as well. We are getting to having a EU level NDC, and there is an increasing scrutiny on on private sector and individual financial institutions and businesses to do their part. Could be messy, but we are getting there. And for me, the member state level is exactly the missing link, because a lot of their operations, a lot of their investments of these individual entities is happening at a local level, and we don't have any sort of accountability. So I understand how with the national plans now under the new proposed MFF, and I'm very happy about it, that we finally can put some accountability on them. We're actually moving into this similar to the RRF framework of money against reforms, politically a difficult sell again. But we need to ensure that all these plans at a national level are happening adequately and being co-designed with the regional level. And I think it's the partnership principle, something that in Europe has been operational for many years, but we need to look at how, and now is exactly the time when we're designing this, to look at the governance structure of how to make sure that this is, we have the proper safeguards, that these plans are co-designed and co-implemented, not only on a member state level, but also regional. And something similar is happening, by the way, in how I see the structure of the European Competitiveness Fund as well. The ECF InvestEU instrument also has a member state compartment to it. The understanding from the current proposal is that a lot of the implementation and where the money flows will be on the basis of work programs. Who designs these work programs? So now is the time to make sure that we have the right design, that this is a collaborative approach and a science-based approach on a member state level and on an instrument level as well.
Thank you very much. We have, I think, time for a couple of questions from the floor. I don't see any hands, though. We have some questions from the Zoom audience. Okay, the first one is, how can we leverage private finance to fund nature-based solutions in cities where they have the most impact on the physical and mental health of people? This is a very specific one.
It works? Yeah. So private finance usually goes where there is a profit. This is the basic principle and a transversal one. So there should be a profit in the project proposal for the private sector to be interested to contribute. Because we do work, and I talk about InvestEU because I know it best. We work with public banks which have a public mandate. And by nature, we intervene into areas where the private sector alone cannot do the job, because either it's not profitable enough or it's too risky and they don't want to engage. So we push the public banks, and they already have a mandate by their member state or by their region to go into particular areas. But very often we require that they also attract private financing. And in equity, that's very much the case. We design market-conform instruments. We need to have at least 30% private participation in the funds. And it works, but it has to be a sellable, credible case that will pass the bank's due diligence. So, yeah, that's an initial general thought.
Thank you. I see Matteo ready to come in.
No, yeah, it's to give an example, because before I already mentioned the social impact bonds, and how this financing works is indeed that with the promise of something you do today is going to save costs tomorrow, you leverage private finance, you fund the projects, in this case, the nature-based solution, And then further down the line, there should be evidence that that has saved some cost to, for example, the healthcare system. Like now they're trying to do food as medicine impact bonds in the Netherlands, which I find it fascinating. The first one was done in a prison in Cambridge in the UK. Here in Brussels was done with refugee integration in the labor market. Like ultimately what I'm trying to say is if there is enough evidence, and that's the question, I don't know if that project suggested it has, but if there is enough evidence showing that certain outcomes have contributed to save public finances, then there are structures in place where you can get private sector investment, because ultimately plenty of banks have financed impact bonds and there is a return on investment. But there has to be that very strong evidence that those outcomes actually generate some cost savings, which, can be very costly and difficult.
Thank you, Matteo. I think we're running out of time, so I'm gonna ask each one of you to share maybe one takeaway message that you get from this conversation we just had. Who wants to start?
No? Okay. I was trying to get away with it. My final message is that there is a lot of momentum, but we are here in our comfortable echo chamber and we more or less all agree, maybe not on all the details, but we need to take all of this and make it mainstream. And it's not an easy task, but I would say we need credible, predictable, long-term solutions, both from a project perspective and an investor perspective.
Yeah, my word would be balance, because it's a big challenge. The expectations to the next MFF, to the Commission, to all the players, to all the policymakers, to industry are very high at this juncture. And it's important to make things right and to strike the right balance. And it's not an easy task, we know it. There are different players with different expectations, with different really ideas how Europe should look like, how financing should look like, how EU instruments should look like. So it's our job to strike the right balance. And I hope we do it right. At least we try.
Yeah, as regards the cap, I think that we need more territorial projects. And probably one of the main criticisms to these long-standing agro-environmental measures in terms of outcomes is because this, in the majority of cases, has been individual farmers applying in a quite scattered way without really having a territorial approach. And this is particularly important for biodiversity. And so this is something that some member states are doing. In Ireland, they have collective measures in which collectively farmers engage into a series of actions in a local context, adapted to them. And there have been many research projects on these, but in the Netherlands as well, but really there are very few experiences. This will be also important for really all in putting landscape elements in a coherent way, ensuring ecological connectivity and all this. And this is something that the Commission is also promoting, but we know that it's not easy to organize for the national administrations. It's not simple. Why we are all the time on the pressure to provide simplification. But the simplification and the environmental management does not always go along. So there are also trade-offs and balance also to keep. So the Commission is now preparing recommendations regarding the next CAP. We are also preparing more soft guidance on best practices, and this collective territorial approach will be one of the things that we will still be promoting, but it's then up to the regions, to the member states to develop this.
Thanks. No, I think it's a complicated moment, right? Because there are big gaps, there are big barriers also. But I think there are also a lot of very interesting and worthwhile examples locally. You talked about some of them. We have a lot in Horizon, Life, and so on. So now is a good moment to try to replicate in scale as much as possible. And for this, I think we need more engagement with outside of the Commission and so on, right? So again, my same mantra from the beginning, would love to have more engagement with insurance players, banks, the corporate world, and so on, to make sure that we shape in the right way the buy side, the market system for nature credits, and so on. So it's more of an ask at this stage than anything else.
Yeah, I'll be very, very quick. I like what you said, Maria, about this territorial place-based approach. I feel quite excited about CAP instruments, nature credits, different instrument targeting a place where lots of land manager can develop projects together and access this new. Ultimately, what I would like to see is those new policy tools coming to play as plug into existing business models. And if those land managers come together, develop projects together, can access those type of new instruments. Yeah, I think it's some exciting projects ahead.
Thank you very much to all the panels. My own takeaway is that this is what we call a wicked problem, and what we're trying to do is break it down to smaller pieces, and each one of us has a role to play in tackling that small piece of this huge wicked problem. And another takeaway message that I get is that we also need to work as multipliers, because you're right, this is a little bit of an echo chamber, and we tend to speak among us, and we don't get out of this circle of people who all agree fundamentally, even though they have slightly different views, and we need to make sure that we go out and we speak with the people that do not agree with us or never heard of us in the first place. But I thank you all for this very interesting panel. I'm standing between you and the coffee break, so I'll stop here, and thank you all for participating.
Yes, so I want to welcome everybody to the second panel today, Private Initiatives for Financing Nature. We have just heard a lot about the EU initiatives, and I think what we're all noticing when we talk about the EU initiatives, then move to the private, that there's not a very clear separation. What we were hearing in the last panel is how the EU is so focused on really setting an enabling environment for private investment. And so, I think a lot of the stage was set at the last panel for ours, and also by our keynote this morning, where we really, I think, got motivated. It was a great talk. We got motivated into how we can really make this work trying to make it work on a very large scale. I think that is really our our big issue here. Large scale, but another thing that I didn't come up so much yet, which for me is important to keep in mind, that it's also urgent. We have, a lot of things that are starting to happen. We heard about this particularly in the last panel, also in the US, starting to happen. We don't have a lot of time. Our societies are used to having more time. In this, both with climate and biodiversity, we're hearing over and over again that we've got to make those targets by 2030, latest 2040, or we are probably facing some irreversible kinds of effects. So I'd like to keep that in mind as we go through today. And so let's see, I have to get my picture off there. It's just not very flattering, is it? Let's see. Okay, here's our panel. I'm going to introduce the panel and then talk a little bit more on some background and the questions I have for the panel. And then I'm going to turn to you. So, so stay alert because you're going to have to be a part of this. So we have a terrific panel. First, we have Verena Kraus, who is actually the senior manager at UNEP Financial Initiative. And she's had long experience working with the private sector, the insurance sector, also with other stakeholders. And I know for a fact what a great job she's doing, because she's got a number of practice sessions, they're called, with the insurance sector, but also others involved, with lots of very, very topical issues. And I've been listening in on that, and it just, So we've got Verena, she's going to talk first. Then we're going to go to Will Butler, who is both the founder and the CEO of an organization called Gaia Secura. Have that right? Yeah. And this is really, I wouldn't say large scale, but it's a really very inspiring insurance brokerage who's working with investors who want to invest in nature and connecting them really with insurance solutions. And then we're going to go to Isabel Royce, who is both if I have this written down not to get it wrong, she's the senior climate and social advisor to the Italian Sustainable Investment Forum. And she was earlier, for many years, actually, at Allianz, where she led a lot of work on sustainability. So, incredibly person who's very, very tied into all the issues we're talking about here. And so then I'm going to go to David Bresch, who is a professor, a professor of weather. I think it's interesting to be a professor of weather and climate risks at ETH. And he, like Isabel, he has a long history also in the insurance industry, where he was at Swiss Re for many years, leading numerous activities, business development, sustainability, the atmospheric perils group. And, I guess he's most known, and maybe trying to get away from this, but he's most known as the chief modeler. So he's a modeler, but much more, I can tell you much more. And I would have introduced Kern Stück, who is here from WWF, Belgium. Unfortunately, had a family emergency just half an hour ago and had to leave. So very, very, keeping our fingers crossed that he'll be back. But I do know that we've got WWF from Switzerland here, and I'm going to hope that WWF from Switzerland will come in at the Q&A to bring in, because we have a great mix here. We've got a mix from the UN, we've got a mix from private initiatives, from the Sustainability Forum, from professorships from academia, and we would have had to round this out, really bringing civil society in here, which would have been so important. And I'm sorry, I've got to introduce also Ursula Bordas. Is Ursula, so we don't have her picture up, huh? Do we? Can we see Ursula?
Good afternoon. I'm connected here.
She's joining us virtually. And I think the last piece of the puzzle to put all this together is really the regulators. And Ursula is from the EIOPA, where she has a long experience in international and EU financial services, and right now leads the policy work on sustainable finance. So she's really a key player in CSRD, SFDR, and the taxonomy. And I guess many of you now are not lost in these acronyms because this has kind of become, the narrative that I think you're all very familiar with. So that's our panel. And if I can move to the questions, I mean, this panel, we could talk until midnight, even longer, all night, sharing all the insights that they would have on this topic. And so my job is to limit them to 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes. And to do that, of course, I wanted to focus in, to ask some more focused questions. Well, I can start. The main question I'd like to ask the panel, and this really ties into the earlier discussions we've had here, and I think it will lay groundwork for all the rest of the discussions we have here at this festival. And that is, actually, what is their opinion? Now, we could all read all the really interesting documents that they have been involved in, and some of them very recent, and we want to hear about that as well. But we really also want to get opinions. That's why we come to these meetings, right? To get to know people and find out what they're thinking. And so the main question that I'm asking them, and this is just an opinionated question, promise we're not going to publish your answers anywhere. We're not going to hold you responsible. If you can, your personal opinion on this. And that is the world on track to close the nature-based solution financing gap by 2030? And then we thought we better also put 2040. So that's our main question. And of course, in thinking about that question, we'd be really interested to knowing, what's driving your optimism or pessimism. And as a part of this festival where we want to kind of, stay optimistic, so what exciting developments are on the horizon? And what, if any, policy changes are needed? Now, I know not all of you are going to answer all these questions, but these are just to give you a few guidelines of things you might touch on in your 5 minutes. So, yeah. But before we move to our panel of incredible experts here, we also have a room full of experts. And so what we would like to do is just do a really quick Mentimeter to get your opinion on this. And we're going to ask you now, and then we're going to ask you at the end, because you can think of these as kind of quick TED Talks. So at the end, have you changed? Has the needle moved? So I'm going to hand this now over to who's going to do this now, to Lara or so, to make sure that you'll get your phones out, stop reading your emails, and click in. And of course, if you don't want to do it, it's fine. But for those of you who are kind of excited about what are the opinions in the room, which will set the stage for our panels here, please go ahead and click on your answer. Yeah, okay. Okay, come on, but we've got 29, 30, we've got 32. Anybody else? We got more people in the room. We got more experts here. How about your opinion? Nobody's going to hold you to it. It's anonymous. Oh, gosh. I wasn't expecting this. Well, I hope the needle's going to move. Yeah, so you can see for yourself, there's a lot of pessimism in this room, and we will see. But, the pessimism also tells us that we've got a job to do. We've got to identify those exciting new developments that we're going to really want to make sure they get out there. And yeah, I was kind of expecting it to be polarized. I was going to say this is a very polarized audience. It doesn't seem to be that polarized. Okay, well, that sets some stage for what we're going to talk about here. So let's just now move. I'd like to hand the microphone first over to, oh no, wait, sorry, I skipped the gap. Okay, but I meant to do that one before. Tell them what the gap is. Doesn't matter. I think it might be useful just to turn now to Verena, who's going to give us a little bit more sort of latest, out of the press information on what that gap is and how she would see this as moving. So, Verena, to you.
Does it work? There we go. Okay, technology is usually not my strong suit. It's more the nature side. So thank you for inviting me. It's very exciting to be here to also meet a lot of the NATURANCE colleagues in person finally, after I have asked them so many times to join my sessions. And before I go into this, just a very quick reflection on this. Actually, I think it's a really great opportunity to have experts like from the NATURANCE project to actually talk also to the industry. So I'm part of UNEP-FI, the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, which is obviously the biggest network between the insurance industry and the UN, really advancing sustainable development. So Joanne asked me to bring you a few updates. So she had a slide earlier that I saw that kind of highlighted the nature-based solution financing gap. I think that is what it was titled. So we have just an update on the status of that financing gap. So last week, the UNEP has published the latest State of Finance for Nature report. It's stated here 2026. It actually uses 2023 data points though. This State of Finance for Nature report really provides a global snapshot of what is the current public and private financial flow into nature-based solutions. It looks here in the context of nature-based solutions for the 3 Rio Conventions and how it supports it. So that's biodiversity, climate mitigation, adaptation, and land degradation neutrality. But it also looks at tracking the nature negative financial flow. So that's a really important one. And maybe some of you have seen the 2023 report, the earlier one. This is now the updated one. And before I move to the next slide, I'm actually going to ask a quick question to the audience. I hope you don't mind. If you think about for every dollar invested in nature, how many dollars are we spending on destroying nature? Any ideas? Oh, she read the report. Come on, Mia. Don't say it. I knew it. Okay, let's maybe do like a hands up. $5. For every dollar invested in nature, we're using $5 to destroy nature. Someone hands up? No? 10? Okay, a few. 15? 20? Yeah, 25? 30? 100. Well, that's Jaro. I think with that number, we would really struggle to save nature here, but it is 30. So for every dollar invested in nature, we're actually spending $30 in destroying it. So that's some staggering number, isn't it? So let me show or explain to you what is on the slide. So first of all, the top part, it looks at the nature-based investments as of 2023, which are $220 billion. Again, this is not biodiversity finance. This is nature-based solutions investments, right? So we have a gap that is shown here as well. We would need $571 billion by 2030 and $771 billion US as well by 2050 to achieve the 3 Rio Conventions. So we have a significant gap in investment in there. So we would need to increase the finance or investments in nature-based solutions 2.5 times to achieve our goal in 2030 alone. Also, maybe some of you have seen the previous report, like probably Mia. In 2022, that same number was $210 billion. So from 210 to $220 billion. Didn't grow too much. On the other side, which I think just following the conversation today in the morning as well, I think there's a lot of, focus and interest on like the investment case in nature and how nature builds resilience, etc. Let's look at that number here. $7.3 trillion is spent annually to destroy nature. It comes 2.4 trillion out of the public sector, which is mostly harmful subsidies. And then it's $4.9 trillion out of the private sector. And it's financing things such as like various utilities, industrials, chemical products, agriculture, etc. So there is a lot of really significant harm being done by finance as of now. Just very quickly coming back to the nature-based solution side, it is, and we have seen this earlier reflected in the comments, about $197 billion in the nature-based solutions investment is actually coming from the public sector, mostly domestic expenditures. I think just about 7 billion is coming from like international development finance. On the other side, private finance is only $23.4 billion in this space. So please keep that big number of $7.3 trillion in mind as well. I'm going to be brief and very quick. So the report, it's often accredited to UNEP-FI, but actually is a UNEP publication and we provide input there. It also includes a couple of additional points, obviously sources of financial flows, which are really encouraged you to look at. But what you see here is again, the annual investment needs in nature-based solutions to reach the Rio targets, both 2030 all the way up to 2050. And what we see here is obviously the gap in 2030, about $350 billion, assuming obviously that the $222 billion stay. The same thing for 2050, where we have $550 billion gap. But what is important to note, and the report calls out as well, the longer we kind of delay this, the more funding investment would need to go into restoration. And that's not as cost effective, obviously, as protection. So it does call out that 20% of the financing into nature-based solution in the context of protection actually covers 80% of the land for nature-based solutions. So there is a cost efficiency aspect to this as well. And then the last one, Joanne, I hope I'm still somewhat in time. It also includes some additional recommendations and suggestions. I thought I'm going to bring this one here because it ties a little bit into the work that we at UNEP-FI do as well. It's the nature transition X curve. So let's not only look at the green curve here, increasing investments into nature, positive outcomes, but also phasing out and repurposing all the negative financial flow. Because at this stage, our investments in nature is being significantly outpaced by these negative impacts. So I think with that, I'm just going to stop here with a bit of an update from this latest finance data on the state of nature. Okay.
Thank you. This was really sobering.
I'm sorry to be a bearer of bad news. I usually
so
try to be more positive.
Now, because we're hearing the last panel. I mean, we're hearing about green and other bonds, resilience bonds. We were hearing about nature credits. We were hearing about a lot of innovations that might narrow that gap. So let me just ask you personally, where would you stand on that scale to 2030? And if you feel it's different to 2040 or even 2050, how do you personally see it?
From a personal perspective, not as UNEP-FI, I probably would be on the not likely side as well for 2030, just given the data points that I've just shared with you. I mean, from 2022 to 23, there was an increase by like 5% annual growth to the nature-based investments that we have had. Mm-hmm. If we continue the growth rate, roughly I did the calculation at home earlier, we are landing at closing the gap by 2043. Right. So we would actually need a way higher rate in growth in the investment in nature-based solutions to just close the gap. Right. So I'm probably going to be more on the.
And that's closing the gap, keeping in mind the investments that are going into negative?
That is not considered
not
in there.
considered.
It's just
Take
about
a-
closing the gap.
But I mean, the message is we really have to look very closely at the nature negatives and
Absolutely.
think very hard about divestment. And I should point out that when I gave the talk, I believe at your practice session, or was that the Cambridge group? No, it was the Cambridge group. We did ask them what the insurers, what did they think would be the most effective way to close the gap? And we had some lists of underwriting and investment pillar, and they all went for divestment. We have to think about divesting out of nature negative. Yeah. So I think that's I think a message, really important message also from your talk.
Yeah.
That, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, this is a hard act to follow, Will.
Yeah.
But let's see what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's an impossible act to follow, actually. For some context for sort of the angle that I'm coming from in this, so yeah, I'm CEO and founder of Gaia Secura, which is an insurance broker in London, Lloyd's broker, specifically for not actually investors in nature, sorry, Joanne, but actually for the nature regeneration projects themselves. So the actors who are undertaking the regeneration of nature across the board. As part of that, we do work with the entire value chain, though, with the investors, the buyers, and the ecosphere that goes on around these projects globally. My other hat as well is the chairman of the Nature and Sustainability Committee for the Insurance Institute of London, which is a CPD committee, effectively. So looking at how we upskill the insurance industry around these pretty crucial topics. And I grew up as a farmer, so you know, there's a personal element there as well. I think with my focus, you know, where we're coming at this, there's for the last 10 years, I've been an insurance broker in the construction world. My knowledge base is based on how insurance operates on a very practical level on a global basis, and how, as an industry, it can influence financial decisions, policy decisions, and simple sort of things like planning and licensing decisions. In a lot of instances, insurance is a legal mandate, it's a legal obligation, and so satisfying your insurance requirements can be a huge driver in whether or not you can do business. And the insurance industry has a huge role to play across the board in these spaces. In terms of, you know, optimism, pessimism, 2030, 2040, will we get there by 2030? The fact that we have to ask the question means it's no. We don't have the momentum isn't there, but it is coming. And I think 2040, it's a very likely at this stage, so long as that momentum continues to shift in the correct way. And, you know, there's so many interesting policy things that were spoken about in the earlier panel that I would have covered to a greater or lesser degree in the influence that they would have had on our industry. But I'm going to skip through because we've already done that element. So I'm going to focus on what I'm seeing as sort of the positive efforts and efficacy that's going on at the moment that I see in influencing the 2040 element. So right now, for example, the fact that I've been able to set up a business that focuses on ensuring actual nature regeneration projects means there is private capital to a degree that allows for those liabilities to be insured. There is enough data for insurance companies to accurately model the risk basis for these projects. There is enough of a private marketplace and buyer and offset market to, you know, create these policies that are now starting to be able to be enacted. And there's a whole load of problems with them. There always is in the inception of a market. I think the first carbon credit insurance policy was four years ago was the first sort of idea behind it. But the fact that that is there means that there is evidence of scale and opportunity for scale as well. Insurance as a concept is an enabler of buyers because it allows certain things. And actually, there's a client of ours recently did a trade, a carbon credit trade with Clyde & Co. And through insuring the carbon credits that were sold, those carbon credits were listed as assets on a balance sheet. Small shifts like that in the way that we look at, and they were nature-based credits, I should point out, small shifts in the way that we look at the current marketplace, everything that's going wrong, but also right, is driving that momentum and is creating more and more opportunity for money to go into the right places. I think we've spoken about investment in a huge degree, and the chap on the panel earlier rightly pointed out, demand is vital now. Like the demand side of these intricate marketplaces that people are coming up with and these clever solutions and all the rest of it. Upfront investment is obviously vital, but as was rightly pointed out, there is pitfalls, yourself here actually, there is pitfalls around the private equity models. If there is no foreseeable revenue in coming through then how does that model sustain itself? It simply doesn't. And so biodiversity net gain is a great example. Where is the demand coming from? And the hope is the infrastructure players coming up soon will as well. But as I say, I think there is momentum enough that so long as the correct application of blended finance policy coupled to good actors, private actors coming through will help drive that. In framework innovations like the Flood Action Coalition in the UK, Rebuilding Nature, various other sort of setups that are harmonizing the non-standardized issues that we've got around all these various different clever initiatives, is bringing this together in a much more easy and cohesive way. There's a huge amount of change that needs to go on. So in terms of the sort of where I think we need to go in order to change things, I'm going to one very specific example, for example, is, and I think I'm going to upset Isabel by going on about carbon credits. When we had a conversation earlier about this, shifts in, change the carbon credit, get rid of the voluntary element, make it mandatory, change it from an offset to an uplift. Why are we talking about offsets? We're just going to stay where we are. Should be talking about uplifts. Biodiversity net gain is a great example of this. Mandate net zero across the board and make sure that people are doing these. Allow for larger value to be attributed to co-benefits, including on the reporting of these credits. It's a flawed system, but it's the system we have. If we want momentum, we need to work with what we have at the moment. Environmental bonds were mentioned earlier by the keynote speaker. There's a huge opportunity there, specifically for the insurance industry. If you have a huge amount of flood risk on your portfolio, if there were an environmental bond, which I'm sure there is around flooding, there should be an incentive to invest into that environmental bond. And I guess, sorry, I have a tendency to waffle. And then finally, I think actually this is not a problem for this room today because we've had some really interesting solutions thrown up. But I think quite often, being on these panels, being in these talks, and we hear people come up with a lot of problems without actually thinking of practical solutions. Practical solutions, even flawed, are the way that we drive these things forward. And if you're able to push that every time you come up with a problem, think of a solution. I think there's a real opportunity there as well.
Thank you. That was, I think, going into also what needs to be done with the policy. That's just, sorry I had to cut you off, but I think we can come back to that. I know that there's some people in here very interested in the biodiversity net gain. And I would have some questions, but I'll hold off on those questions. But can I get did I hear you that you're fairly, let's say, at no or not likely for 2030? And where are you for 2040?
I'm no for 2030, 100%, sadly. Very pessimistic 2030, but then I think swing all the other way for 2040. I'm a hopeless optimist. I think 2040, yes, we will get there.
Because you think there's some momentum building with the legislation, the offsetting, which is for me one of the bright spots. I got lots of questions from what you said, but I think that we'll leave it there and we'll move on to Isabel to give us her view on this.
Sorry, without glasses at my age, I can't see what it says, right? So I bring a little bit of a different perspective. The Italian Sustainable Investment Forum is an association where you have asset owners, asset managers, that means banks, insurance companies, foundations, but you also have NGOs, we also have associations in it. So it's a very multi-diverse. So what they're seeing and how they're approaching biodiversity might be a little bit different. But at the end, those are the people who are going to create the demand that you need, right? So we need to sometimes think outside of the bubble we're sitting in here, because we are sitting in a bubble. We know what we're talking about. We're talking about biodiversity. You take it out of the bubble, maybe biodiversity is not even on their radar. Sustainability is, but not maybe biodiversity. So sometimes thinking also a little bit outside of the bubble, how can we create demand? So I was, from the beginning on this panel, and they were a little bit surprised when I said I was a clear no in 230. But I'm a yes on the 240, I agree. I agree on the 240. I don't agree on the 230, it's a no. but this has different things. What are asset managers, asset owners, foundation banks, insurance companies seeing out there right now? They're seeing a geopolitical environment that is hostile to anything that has to do with sustainability. Regardless if it's biodiversity, climate, water, it is completely hostile. It's completely hostile to science. A lot of companies are not stating what they're doing. Why? They're doing something called greenwashing. They're doing the right things. They're not talking about it because they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. Somebody's going to sue them, either the NGO or a politician on one side or the other one. So a lot of people are not saying anything. So for me right now, I think it's very difficult to reach 230 to really get the financing going. The other issue is a different, completely different one. Up to now, and here I continue using the broad sense of sustainability, is seen as a compliance, as a reporting issue. And I think people are starting to realize it is not a compliance, it is not a reporting issue, it is a risk issue, a real risk issue. And I think the forerunners on this and the ones that are giving also an impetus in Europe surrounding the risk issue is EIOPA, EBA, and ECB. If you listen to what they're talking and how they're talking about risk, it becomes very clear. And we saw it, we are in Italy, so we've seen it, right? Floods, inundations, everything that's happening around of that. It's everything that's happening around that. It is very, very clear in Italy. We now have obligatory insurance for that as of the small and mid caps are going to have the obligation by the end of March. So every company operating in Italy has to have a natural catastrophe insurance. Why? Because it was costing the government too much. So what happens when it becomes uninsurable? The risk. Who's going to cover the risk? The first one's going to be the banks. Because if a company doesn't have insurance, it's going to go belly up. And who has the loan to the company? The banks. So the banks and the insurance know this is a risk. And that's where we're seeing the push. And I think that's where the push is going to come for the change. Because once people realize it's a risk and not a compliance issue, you're going to see real change. Where's the demand going to come from? That's the big issue. First time I saw the Savings Investment Union being talked about, and I know we don't have all of the details and we're still waiting for them. But when I saw that one, I said, okay, now I know where it's going to come from. The Savings Investment Union, it's a huge amount of money that is sitting right now in normal bank accounts in Europe. Let's convert it to invest in Europe, right? So let's see if that one does it and does it the right way, combined with what I call the 28th regimen, but it's also called EU Inc., which is basically within 24 or 48 hours, you can create a company in Europe and it's licensed in all states, all 27. So that's, I think, is very important. But the Savings and Investment Union, think about it. What are they going to buy? If you go, I did an analysis and looked at, it's the older people who tend to have more of the money of that. So what are they going to invest in? Are they going to go for something like an offset over this with the blended? Nah, at least in Italy, they're going to go for the bonds. And if it's a government bond, that's what they're going to buy. So what do we need to do? We need to get within the Savings and Investment Union, please at least mention sustainability, climate change, biodiversity, and maybe the states could think about a very nice incentive to whoever buys these wonderful nature bonds, which we now have the new ICMA secondary label for the green bonds. Don't create a completely different one. The green bond market is very liquid. Everybody likes it. Put it as a secondary label under there. That's something. And if a government issues it, why shouldn't a grandmother buy it? Today, we were talking about one of our use cases in biocapital, pollinators, right? You know, are you not going to be able to sell to your grandmother the Maya bee green bond? Naturally. But that's how you do it. Thank you. That's how I'll leave it there.
Okay. Then I understand it's no for 2030 and yes for 40. And our last Mentimeter, we're going to put both of those questions because it seems that this is something very interesting. 2030, no. 2040, yes. I would question that, but let me come back to that in the discussion. So, David, you have now it turns out the last word. So, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Two things. I like the fact, first, thanks a lot for the kind invitation. Also to many of the audience, I do like these conversations and figure how can we broaden the audience, how we can reach new constituencies who do not yet share some of these views. That's definitely more on my mind than the particular details, the nitty-gritty. But what was funny when you introduced me, you were laughing at the title of a professor. And I think that's a right attitude. We're just human beings. We have our feelings, our concerns, the things we share, and that's much more important. And I've always been driven by curiosity. So I joined the reinsurance sector to really understand what big finance means all about. And then after 16 years, I went back to academia, felt now I'm probably at the stage where I can tell the next generation how I feel about some of these things. And that's close to my heart. The reason I also felt it's maybe to know to 2030, but likely big things going to be changed by 2040 and 50 is, for me, it's social tipping points. I'm a physicist by training, but I do believe in societies moving in super non-linear fashion. And fashion has a big role to play. You mentioned demand side. I think you've mentioned that, has just come up before. There is probably a need for some mandatory push for things to happen, but it could find democratic support for some of these boundary conditions in which we'd like to operate as societies in order to really internalize known externalities, and thereby really known by now. When I joined Swiss Re in 2000, it was good enough for science from the IPCC to just get it going. And then in the preparation to 2009 Copenhagen, we felt we should really work such that the models we use to price risks can also be used to appraise adaptation options. And I've been a bit on this track since to make the case for economics of adaptation. And in that case, we learned the nature-based part is an extremely attractive one because it's at least 1 to 4. $1 spent is $4 of risks mitigated or losses avoided. Challenge being trust. Most of the business is written still on an annual basis. And if you want to invest in long-term solutions, it needs time. And if you are the reinsurer who provides your client with a benefit of that investment being made, you're not so sure next year you win the contract again. So there is an element of time dependence we have to take into account. I would very much support action for binding longer term contracts, and that goes a bit also in your case about the investment side on the pensions, because most people do need the money when they're retired and not tomorrow. And they currently invest in a world they probably likely not want to retire in. And so the social tipping point might also come from that side that people start to realize. And there's one element of hope I also see on the policy side. If you looked at the air quality in China years ago, it was really bad. I've never been there, been told. And policy can make a change. And it seems that people do sometimes support these things, which also are to their own benefits. So there is an element of coercive power of a shared interest you can bring through policy back to the how to say, the constituency, so to say. But it's not a trivial thing, but there's also another silver lining on the horizon. You probably know in Switzerland, we have mandatory insurance, and it's even provided by a monopoly. The monopoly is a state-owned piece, but it's independent of the taxpayer. So it must be independently capitalized and totally true and open to the risk it has to bear. And so risk modeling and transparency about risk is something which I do believe in. It makes a difference. It's not trivial to communicate. And that's why the model I build, I do not build these models because I would believe in them, but I think they're often a very good discussion starter. So underpinning a dialogue with some credible numbers, as the first speaker has done, is extremely helpful for us to move forward.
Thank you, David. And apologies to Ursula. I said David was the last speaker here because we had to take a chair away. But of course, we have our very last speaker, but certainly not least, because in my opinion, and I think this has come out now a lot in the discussion of, how much does the regulatory environment, how much of a role is the regulatory environment going to play, and hopefully moving that needle. We have Ursula with us. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. And so I'll give the floor right over to you.
Thanks a lot, and I hope you can hear me well. Apologies I cannot be with you in Brussels. I would have loved to be there on stage with you. Quite a pessimistic view from my side today. I think that we are not on track, definitely, for closing the financing gap by 2030, but also not for 2040. And that is because, as David was mentioning, it depends on the fashion, right? So I do not think that biodiversity protection and restoration is in fashion, unfortunately. I think in Europe, at least, we have seen, efforts to that. We have done a lot on climate change. Then the second step was, well, let's now move to biodiversity. That's the second and more connected risk with climate change that has a big impact. And that is as well bringing many risks to our economy. So to manufacturing, to agriculture, different sectors are very much exposed to the impacts of biodiversity loss. So it is as well very important from an economic perspective, but all we see is going into the opposite direction. So I think we need really to build another momentum in a way, to have this fashion brought back internationally. And I'm sorry to say, but I don't think Europe can do that alone. So all of this is interconnected, of course, and we depend on each other. And if we don't restore this trust and build a strong international cooperation, it will be very difficult by 2040 to have strong solutions. On your more specific questions, you were mentioned as well policy, and for sure policy has helped a lot. So here, and I think today you probably have discussed this, the European solutions, right? We have quite a lot of legislation being developed and now revised. So what Isabel was mentioning, the reporting compliance is not enough, and it should not be seen as such. So on one side, we have this, big efforts to bring more private investment directly from consumers, but there is too much expectation that this is enough, so that these market-based solutions are enough. And that's definitely a risk that we have here. So it's not the consumer choice will not fix a systemic crisis. And that's something that we have to understand to look for other solutions. So bringing public financing for sure, also some mandatory other solutions that are not just about incentivizing more investments, as said, from consumers. Most consumers have a lot of behavioral biases, as you probably know, that make them very difficult, the choice of financial products. I think Isabel was mentioning this tendency also to go into government bonds, for example, or safer investments, or investments that they are more used to. So we see that in all our mystery shoppings exercises at the point of sale, that consumers actually don't choose the greener investments, and this is here about biodiversity, but also about some other sustainability aspects. And so I really think this cannot be the only solution. It is one important element of the puzzle, but it is definitely not sufficient. Then moving into the disclosure, CSRD, I think it has been very helpful. And by the way, SFDR disclosures transparency as well. I mean, by addressing, putting a name on things and being able to measure impact, we can actually provide with figures, right? We have identified that 30% of insurers direct corporate investments, so on corporate bonds and equity, are directly depending on at least one ecosystem service, in particular on water. And also from our SFDR disclosures on the negative impact of investments, we can see that on average, actually only around 6% of investments are negatively affecting biodiversity sensitive areas. That's very specific. But some of them, some financial market participants have much higher this exposure. So they actually affect at 90%, for example, biodiversity sensitive areas. All of this information can be used in a very good manner to make choices and opt for those banks, insurers, asset managers that actually have lower negative impacts if, again, consumers, professional and retail investors care. But for that, we need indeed this fashion to be back. And then my second point is what you were mentioning before in the panel, so the aspect of the risking. And here, of course, that is crucial for EIOPA. We have last year published our first report on biodiversity risk management. As you know, in Europe, this is a requirement for insurers to address biodiversity risk and manage such risks. And this includes different type of risks, but we see that mostly this is still quantitative type of measurement and assessment of these risks. So we don't see yet a lot of quantitative information that would be certainly more useful for insurers to be able to put figures on their exposure to biodiversity risks and then to quantify this, the financial impact, the financial risk they are exposed to. On our side, what we do is for sure trying to identify more, assess these financial impacts. For example, also in cooperation with other institutions, the European Central Bank has identified in particular water scarcity. They have developed a methodology on water at risks. And shows that we have a high dependency on this, and water risk can actually threaten 15% of economic output in Europe. So we need more development on modeling, on quantification of risks, and then, of course, also solutions to address them. So quantification of risks, first step. Providing solutions would be the second one, but for that I think we need a bit indeed of more appetite and be it brought in fashion indeed.
Okay, thank you very much. I it resonated a lot with me what you were talking about, and probably everybody up here and out there. So it was good. It was really good to hear you put it so clearly. I will come back to everybody, I think, at some point to see where we can move this, what sort of policy, and particularly EIOPA, like when I compare the kind of power that regulators have in Europe over insurers, for instance, and compare that with certain states in the US, it's quite a difference. So I'd like to get your opinion on that. But before I do that, I really want to turn this now to the audience. This is, kind of Q&A. How much time are we going to have for Q&A now so we can stay on track here? So half an hour. Okay, so don't let me down. You've all been, I know, listening closely. I've been watching. And I would like to hear, now we know where you stand. We know that, that you're not terribly optimistic that this is just going to happen. So I think it would be very good to hear what needs to be done so that you would feel more optimistic. Where do we need to go? If we could put up, if we could change the world by waving a wand right now, what would you actually do? And I think keeping in mind that this is urgent, and incredibly important. This is existential. It's existential for us, and it's urgent. So this is not just a kind of a fun exercise. It's a really important exercise. So now I've scared you all off from saying anything, but please let's hear your questions also, of course, to not just your opinions, but also our questions to our panel here. Great. Okay, you'll take the microphone. You have to hold the microphone right to your mouth.
Let's try. Thank you very much. My name's Angela Falconer. I'm working with Climate Shot Impact Investors Coalition. We focus on agri-food systems, and I'd love to hear from the panelists of any good examples that you're seeing that are helping to drive private finance towards transition of agri-food systems for climate and nature benefits, and any reflections on the policy side of things with this being such a heavily subsidized area as well. What can be done going forward? Okay.
I think we heard a little bit about that also with our past panel. So if anybody from our past panel also wants to come in here, but first, do we have somebody who can feels that they have some expertise on this? Verena? Oh, okay. Isabel, go ahead.
I actually would address it through a different lens potentially as well, through a health and well-being and diet lens. I know and I've seen this a few times, the agri-food system comes up a lot in terms of one of the key issues in relation to nature and biodiversity, obviously, in terms of subsidies. But I think what we sometimes, and it comes a little bit from a personal angle as well, we fail to address is actually the consumer side of this is, and we work, in my role, we work with non-life insurers and life and health insurers, which really starts kind of seeing clearly the nexus between environmental impact, lifestyles, and human health, right? So we are engaging with life and health insurers to better understand what they're upstream through hospital systems, healthcare systems, as well as downstream through their consumer can have an impact on nature and their own health. And diets come up as the key priority issue here. Not sure if any one of you has seen the Eat Lancet Commission reports, they published now the second iteration of the report. They developed something that's called a planetary health diet, and it discusses that the food systems are the key driver to breaching 5 of the planetary boundaries. And they propose this new approach to a healthier, sustainable diet that is less meat heavy, more plant-based, healthier, and that can basically stay within the planetary boundaries. And that's something that we're engaging with our life and health insurers right now as well. So if we talk about agri-food system, sorry, I was just thought I'm going to throw in a new innovation, a new way. It's let's not only look at the production side of things, but also look at the consumption side of things that could drive this.
I'm just going to swap my hat to put my dad's hat on as a farmer. I think it's important to remember that, we talk about all these agri-food systems and all the rest of it. And actually on the micro level, we're talking about farmers. And a farmer is operating on 0.5% margin, if that. And so the risk involved in adopting some of these programs and the rest of it on a year-by-year basis, if it goes wrong 1 year, they can lose a lot of money, and that can be devastating for a farmer just on a single basis. There are some phenomenal insurance policies out there, but they're too expensive for a farmer to have. So the collective power is very important in these schemes, and working with supply chains on that side of it to create more of a sort of a risk transfer or a unifying, almost going back to that collective methodology of farming, transfer risk between all cooperating on a scheme, or have the supply chain take it on, because ultimately it's their resilience of their supply chain that is at risk from not acting. But if we're looking at this just on an annual basis, 1 bad year is going to stop a farmer from doing these things. And so we need to make sure that there is a longer term guarantee for them.
Yeah, if I can sort of abuse my chair thing here. I've been very interested in how we could set up sort of public insurers that de-risk this de-risk for the farmer, de-risk for people. Like just quickly, we did a project in Norway where we interviewed municipalities. And I remember the one mayor of a small municipality, they were looking at landslide risk. And she said, listen, she said, we've got a kindergarten down there. Do you really want me to take a chance on a nature-based solution, putting up wood things, when in fact it could fail and you can't tell me the probability of it failing? Okay, but take away the kindergarten and say it's a material loss that they're worried about. We could de-risk that for her. You know, I don't think we can de-risk lives lost, but we can de-risk material kinds of losses. And I think that could be incredibly important. So I'll leave it there because I think, do you want to say, David? Go ahead, please.
Now, yeah, just a very, very quick thought to that. I mean, most agricultural insurance is heavily subsidized. And especially if you look at hail insurance, because people understand it's an act of God. It's not a single farmer who does something wrong. In Switzerland, it took about 20 years to establish it because farmers felt, I can influence the outcome. Totally strange. Now it's more science-based and it's there. But you could say the transition risk in farming, you could easily put to an insurance scheme. And would you make that one mandatory? It would just happen. But it is this very strong policy kind of intervention to say you have to be insured, then basically can embark on the transition. But there are these elements that could be put in place.
Just a final comment on that. Sometimes where policy fails, others can step up, and with farmers, there are unions, very powerful unions, and they will, you know, they represent the right side of this. So I think there's conversations to be had there as well, definitely.
Okay, that was a great question. I see, stirred a lot of comment. So let's hear from our audience. Are we still have time? 20 minutes, great. Okay, we can take several questions. And please say your name, where you're from.
Sure. My name is Anja. I'm from Zurich, from the organization of Net Zero Cities. I'm interested in the concept of avoided losses. So we discussed earlier that avoided losses are a key driver for nature finance. That being said, insurers would directly benefit from that because they have lower damages to pay out. So I was wondering, why haven't we seen a scalable model that implements that logic? I mean, there is examples out there, but I just don't see it being scaled yet. And I'm wondering why.
I'll answer that from a very quick, practical basis, and then it's far more intelligent people can answer from a policy basis. But from a practical basis, insurance policies operate on an annual cycle. And you may have one insurer that's insuring a house downstream from a river that floods every year, but next year they might not be the same insurer. So why would they invest in a project that has a 10-year cycle if they don't know they're going to be insuring that project within a year's time? It's called the free rider problem, and it's a common across the board, and that goes all the way up to portfolio levels as well. And very quickly that becomes a blocker to any conversations with insurers on the underwriting perspective. And it's the same thing for influencing underwriting. Why should I reduce my premium on an insurance policy when I could lose this policy next year? So long-term insurance policies can be a solver for this, and conversations with the reinsurance industry can be a solver for this. But it's a much harder conversation when you get away from the locality. Nature is locally focused. So we need frameworks in place across a national level, across portfolio levels, to operate on these types of bases. That's very quick.
I'm really happy you said that, because I think the competitive environment, we don't appreciate the competitive environment the insurers operate in and how they really need to work on the short-term basis because the contracts are short-term. So, Verena, you want to add?
Yeah, I might just add some work that we are doing at UNEP-FI on the topic as well. And I know many of the partners here are participating. I also think it's a signal perspective as well. So we obviously understand that we had it in the context of nature-based solutions, and avoided losses are not considered in catastrophe models. You could also argue the other way around, right? Nature destruction is not covered in catastrophe models. I mean, one of the clearest examples I could just think of was like the floods that we saw in Asia, Sumatra, right? They had the heaviest floods and landslides, but one of the key drivers for the significant floods and landslides were because of deforestation due to palm oil plantation, right? So that angle, it's both ways. It's like avoided losses, but also increased losses where nature is being degraded. And that's something where I'm really very unfortunate to see all the faces here nodding, like Jaro and Neil back there as well. We have a working group at the UNEP-FI level. It is now 47 insurers, reinsurers, and brokers, and about 20 plus are technical contributors and consultative group members. And one of the many areas that we are working on this year is quantifying a couple of things. First, the state of ecosystem conditions in catastrophe models. That goes both ways, right? And we are also engaging with like risk modelers on that side of things. But it's not only, I think, the consideration, the quantification and consideration that would then lead to the fact that there is finance available for nature-based solutions, right? As you just described, because it does not necessarily lead to that point. So that's probably the second part that we're going to be working on, but there are some models coming up, community-based, but there are also only corporate-led activities. I have seen one example where an insurance product was provided to a wind farm in a coastal area, and they have by themselves invested into mangrove restoration, and they really have quantified the reduction of the maintenance costs that were so high enough that they could provide a premium. So it was really like the conversation with that customers where it made sense for them. And then I think we also think a lot when we talk here, you tell me when I'm going too long, when we talk here a lot about the climate-nature nexus, right? What we also see in working with our insurers is there is, I sometimes call it standalone nature-related risks. I know they're not standalone, but issues like pollinator loss, water security, water quality, all of these other nature-related hazards are risks to supply chains, to insurance customers. They don't have risk cover at this stage as well. They can't assess it, they can't quantify it. So it's almost like you see like a different level of risk arising that also is a potential future market. And obviously there's the other side with like the biodiversity net gain and like, biodiversity credits and those sort of things. But that alone, the kind of the nature destruction itself is something that we really need to start kind of looking into as an insurer.
And that's a kind of wake-up call, isn't it? I mean, I know that even at my institute, we've been doing CAP models for 20 years or so, longer, and the big challenge has been putting in climate change. But now I'm hearing, hey, we should also be putting in nature degradation. It's as important. So that's, I don't know if David wants to talk to that. I know that you were a the chief modeler at Swiss Re. How do you see the future on actually going even beyond putting climate change, but putting in nature degradation?
I mean, there has always been the slow onset and the kind of sudden accidental piece to it. And it's a known fact in insurance that the deferred maintenance, and you mentioned it in your keynote, we operate on an infrastructure has been built in the past and sometimes not really up to the task. That's part of the conversations. I know that from inside out. That's true. The challenge is often, and that's where a market might not wisely allocate, because if it's a myopic market behavior of most of the market players, then this gets sidelined up to the Harvey, Sandy. You can name all these things, wake-up calls, and each time it's this big moment to say, "Oh, we should have known," and so on. But most decision makers in their term in office fare better if they sideline these things than if they openly address them. And it's very, very difficult the way we currently operate these complex infrastructures to bring that back in. One way is transparency, definitely. One way is the TCFD, this kind of all these approaches to bring physical risk to it, and we're moving there slightly, surely, yeah. But on the other hand, and I think you mentioned it too, a lot is happening on the ground, but people currently are not so much willing to talk about things. And there, I do believe that especially cities, and it's nice to have ICLEI as a convener here, cities are definitely the pivotal point that people do speak with the way they move, the way they gather, and these things, they do change, but sad but true, it's really hard to bring them to the scale we need.
Okay, thank you. Do we have time for, I see another hand is up here. 2 hands are up. Okay, 15 minutes to close. Can we take one more question or maybe 2 quick? Well, okay, we'll close quickly because I really would like to hear from Mia and also from you because, we would like a WWF perspective, which we unfortunately lost. So maybe you can ask us a question anyway.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mia Wilkie. I'm from WWF Switzerland. Super interesting. My question would be, since in a lot of panel discussions I've heard in conferences, many people say, yeah, it's a joint effort, it's a collaborative effort, we cannot do it alone. So my question would be, since you're such a diverse group, what are the barriers or some of the barriers you face in your sector, and what would you need from other actors, especially like as we have regulators here, we have insurance or brokers, we have national and transnational and also academia here. Like, what would you need from other actors in support? Maybe it's a big question.
Maybe we'll take 2 and take them both just because of time, because I believe you had a question as well.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I'm Vilon Ooms, policy advisor at the Dutch Association of Insurers. We're quite tackling with different horizons actually. So already mentioned that like an insurance product is only for 1 year basically. Mortgage 30 years, biodiversity investment also long term. Farmers then like also like short term. So yeah, I'm quite curious how you think like, how can we tackle that problem of like different horizons that we see?
Okay, so we have a question on collaboration, and I was to say, we're missing WWF here. Then we have really diversity, and how would we all collaborate also with WWF in moving forward? And then our second question was really on the horizon, which has been a very big issue for a while. And I know Walter's here. We had a good colleague at Wharton, Howard Kuhnreuther, was kind of iconic in the US for insurance. And he was constantly saying, we must make insurance longer term contracts for a lot of reasons. So do we have some perspectives on those questions from our panel?
I'll just give 2 answers very quickly. Sorry. On the collaborative, for me, it's engagement. And we have a permanent working group working on engagement, and biodiversity is one of the things we do. And we're also the only one who's doing a state engagement. We engage the Italian state. And one of the questions is also concerning biodiversity. On the short, long-term horizon, bonds are pretty long-term, as long as you want them, right? And you got something called a cat bond too, right? So I think there are instruments.
I would like to turn it actually to Ursula, who's not had much to say. I'm sorry, Ursula, you're behind me, unfortunately. So why don't you come in on this?
No problem. Just on the first question, I think we need political support, because we can, in the sector try to collaborate, and that's very important. We have highlighted this in our biodiversity report, that this collaboration, public-private partnerships, also for natural catastrophes, for sharing of data. We have at the IOPA now a center of excellence for natural catastrophes data and modeling. All of these efforts, we can make them. But if we don't have political support, for regulators, it's very difficult to push this forward, such ideas of collaboration involving the public authorities, to justify having staff working on this and putting forward biodiversity in our work, prioritizing this. and not just focusing, on climate change, which still, at least in Europe, is still being supported. So political support actually comes also from the industry. I mean, the change of this agenda in the EU came because of a very strong private opposition to it. So it's industry influencing politicians, and then regulators we can help. And of course, sectorally, this collaboration can still happen, but we need as well this high-level support.
Thank you. Okay, let's have one more comment, and then we're going to turn back to our Mentimeter.
Well, I was just going to say on the subject of collaboration, I'm going to be a bit combative here, but can you please put your hand up if you work for a traditional insurance company? A traditional insurance company. Work for, yeah, if you work for a traditional insurance company. There's, collaboration. There's no need to treat the private sector at arm's length. We should be in the room. They should be in the room. They should be here. There should be underwriters here. There should be modelers. There should be consultants from insurance companies here. This is a huge research project. This is an amazing piece of work, but there is no one here from the sector that we're talking about. So, that in itself, I think, is an indictment of where we need to be in terms of collaboration.
Yeah, certainly we have a few on our panel that have a long history in insurance companies, but I agree. I completely agree. And I think we do have a few here. I've met. Sorry? You want to say, okay, let's go, David, last word.
Because I've been on the board of WWF Switzerland, and I felt like a fool in one of the first two board meetings, and I learned a lot. And then I was able to contribute. And I think what really would help if we would more often switch our hats and do things we're not good at, but we have an eager kind of an inner craving to understand. Because I think that makes the difference. I often tell my students, environmental system science, go for a bank, go for the regulator job, because there you can make a difference, and you can learn very fast in an environment which does not think the way you think. And that's probably, and it has an element of, it's also a fascinating experience. It's tough, but it's really fascinating. And if we do more of that, we would make a difference.
Okay, very good. And you have certainly switched your hat. So yes, a man who's to his word. And I know we've had some stakeholder meetings where we ask people to play the roles, different roles. It's really interesting. Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to repeat our Mentimeter as sort of ending here. No, let's do the Mentimeter, then we do the wrap-up slide. I think what has arisen from our panel is that we can't just ask 2030. We've also got to ask 2040, because it was very, very interesting what came out here. And I wonder if that's going on in your own heads. So we're going to have two questions. We're going to repeat the first one and see if the needle has moved for 2030. And then it moved left. Okay, all right. It's there's another one coming, but we still have quite a few people who haven't done it, so we're waiting. I see people still trying to get into their phone.
This is always 2030, not 2030.
This is 2030. We'll ask a second question on 2040. This one is still 2030. Okay, definitely. It definitely moved left. Well, I think when we heard about all of that money that's going into negative and into the negative economy, I think that was very sobering. I'm not surprised it moved left. Okay, we've had 35 responses. If you still haven't had a chance to respond, put up your hand and we'll hold it a little bit longer. Okay, so let's do the same for 2040 now. Mm-hmm. But we did move quite a lot from no. Actually, quite a lot. even got even got 3 likelies. That's really interesting. I won't ask you to identify. Yeah, a lot of maybes. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we have to ask ourselves, is 2040 too late when we talk about how urgent all of this is? We see it moving, and that's how we've always done in our societies. We do move gradually, that we're kind of programmed for that, incremental movement, but we're hearing a lot, we need transformational movement. So is incremental okay? Ask yourselves that, and we can be asking ourselves that throughout the rest of this conference. I did ask Laura to do a wrap-up slide, so I certainly want to see. I mean, it's not easy to wrap this up, but let's see how that wrap-up slide looks like. And we've lost this on the front here. So Laura, why don't you come up and read this, because this is how you've seen it going, and I can tell you that our team here has been really, really helpful.
Well, Kelly and myself, we were trying to get some notes and also all the ideas that came from the panel. So thank you very much. Of course, we might have missed like the detail, but some general ideas. Like I think one of the phrases that we definitely got in our minds was what Verena has said. So for $1 that we invested, then this 30 that are still like gets kind of like in the financing for nature destruction, or kind of like what is that kind of like the impact of this phrase. So that made us a little bit to think about what we are doing and how are we investing. Definitely, we heard a lot in different perspectives here as well about the demand. So demand is vital. So we need a little bit more from this. And also talking about the markets and how this depends on a clear demand and revenue certainty. Another of the things that we also catch was the risk need to become more quantifiable, with nature-based products requiring trust and long-term commitment. So also this last bit is very important. So we have talked about how we need to like really commit to whatever that we want to finance, but having in mind nature-based as key. And finally, also one important thing that we thought it was important to mention here is stay curious. We liked it all a lot this. So change and think outside of the box. Try to get a little bit more interest in other perspectives. So that is also another thing that this festival wanted to bring together. So try to learn from each other. Learning from others, from other disciplines. And yes, I think that was kind of like what we got from this panel. So thank you again, all of you, and also Ursula back home. So I give you the mic.
Yes. Thank you. This panel has been, I hope you've got something out of this. We're around now for a few days. Let's talk in the coffee breaks. Let's interact, and got some great presentations and just discussions tomorrow. And we have, I think, our dinner. It's just waiting for us here. So thanks to the audience. Thanks for the team here to be so helpful. Thank you very much to the panelists, and you have a